Long before humanity took its first tentative steps beyond Terra, before the Eldari reached the heights of their psychic mastery, and countless eons before the Emperor walked among men, the galaxy belonged to far older powers. Among these ancient races, none would prove more fateful to the cosmos than the Necrontyr, a species whose very existence was defined by suffering, and whose desperate pursuit of immortality would reshape reality itself. The Necrontyr evolved on a world whose name has been lost to the passage of 60 million years, though the scars of their origin remain etched into their metallic forms. Their homeworld orbited a malevolent star that bathed the planet's surface in lethal radiation, creating an environment so hostile that it would have been uninhabitable to most species. The star itself was ancient and unstable, its coronal mass ejections and solar flares bombarding the planet with waves of hard radiation that penetrated deep into the crust. This stellar poisoning became the defining characteristic of Necrontyr existence, seeping into their very genetic structure and condemning them to brief, pain-filled lives. The Necrontyr physiology bore the unmistakable marks of this cosmic curse. Their flesh was pale and translucent, stretched thin over brittle bones that showed through their skin like shadows. Tumors and cancerous growths were commonplace, appearing even in their youth as their cells mutated under the constant bombardment of radiation. Most Necrontyr rarely lived beyond what other species would consider adolescence, their bodies failing them just as they reached intellectual maturity. Those fortunate few who survived longer bore the accumulated damage of their poisoned world, skin that sloughed away in patches, organs that functioned poorly, and bones so brittle they could snap under minimal stress. Despite these physical limitations, or perhaps because of them, the Necrontyr developed an extraordinary mastery of technology. Their short lifespans created a culture of urgency and innovation, where each generation built frantically upon the work of their predecessors. They became masters of energy manipulation, developing weapons that could strip atoms apart and defensive systems that could bend space itself. Their architecture reflected their technological prowess, vast cities of living metal that could repair themselves, structures that existed partially outside normal space-time, and monuments that defied conventional physics. The Necrontyr's expansion beyond their cursed homeworld began as a desperate search for survival. They developed faster-than-light travel through their mastery of dimensional manipulation, creating vessels that could slip between layers of reality to traverse vast distances. Their ships were marvels of engineering, constructed from materials that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, making them nearly indestructible by conventional means. These vessels carried Necrontyr colonists to worlds across the galaxy, establishing a vast empire that would eventually span millions of star systems. Their colonies followed a distinctive pattern, each one a testament to Necrontyr ingenuity and their ongoing struggle against mortality. They constructed massive medical complexes dedicated to extending their brief lives, research facilities where they studied the nature of death itself, and communication arrays that allowed them to share knowledge across their growing empire instantaneously. Yet despite their technological achievements, they could not escape the fundamental curse of their biology. Even on worlds far from their radioactive sun, Necrontyr children were born with the same genetic damage, the same predisposition to early death. This expansion brought the Necrontyr into contact with other galactic powers, most notably the Old Ones. Where the Necrontyr were cursed with brief, agonizing existences, the Old Ones enjoyed lifespans measured in geological epochs. These ancient beings were the galaxy's first sentient species to achieve mastery over the warp, using their psychic abilities to seed life across countless worlds and guide the evolution of younger races. To the dying Necrontyr, the Old Ones represented everything they could never be: immortal, wise, and blessed with the time to see their works come to fruition across millennia. The contrast between the two species could not have been more stark. While Necrontyr scientists labored for decades to achieve breakthroughs that might extend life by mere years, Old Ones contemplated projects that would unfold over millions of years. The Old Ones' mastery of biological manipulation allowed them to craft new species with the same casual ease that Necrontyr engineers might design a new machine. Most galling of all, The Old Ones possessed the power to grant longevity to their favored species, yet they refused to share this gift with the suffering Necrontyr. The Necrontyr's initial diplomatic overtures to the Old Ones were met with what they perceived as condescending indifference. The Old Ones, secure in their ancient wisdom and vast temporal perspective, viewed the Necrontyr as a young species that would either adapt to their circumstances or perish, a natural part of galactic evolution. They failed to comprehend the depth of Necrontyr desperation or the intensity of their desire for life extension. This dismissal planted the seeds of a hatred that would eventually consume both species and plunge the galaxy into its first Great War. Necrontyr society developed along rigid hierarchical lines, shaped by their struggle against mortality and their technological achievements. At the apex of their civilization stood the dynasties, ancient noble houses whose bloodlines could be traced back to the first colonists of their various worlds. Each dynasty controlled vast territories, commanding fleets of ships and armies of warriors, yet even their nobles succumbed to the same genetic curse that afflicted all Necrontyr. The dynasties competed fiercely among themselves, engaging in elaborate political maneuvering and occasional warfare as they vied for resources, territory, and the slim hope of discovering some technological solution to their mortality. The noble houses beneath the dynasties formed a complex web of alliances and rivalries. These houses specialized in different aspects of Necrontyr society, some focused on military technology, others on medical research, still others on the exploration of new worlds. Each house maintained its own research facilities, armies, and fleets, contributing to the overall strength of their patron dynasty while pursuing their own agendas. The competition between houses drove rapid technological advancement, as each sought to develop innovations that would give them an edge over their rivals, or more importantly, might lead to a breakthrough in life extension. At the pinnacle of this hierarchical structure sat the Silent King, the supreme ruler of all Necrontyr. Unlike the squabbling dynasties and houses beneath him, the Silent King commanded absolute authority over the entire species. His word was law, his decisions binding upon all Necrontyr regardless of their station or allegiance. The title itself reflected the nature of his rule. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his pronouncements carried the weight of divine mandate. The Silent King's court was a marvel of Necrontyr engineering, a vast complex that existed partially outside normal space-time, allowing him to communicate instantaneously with his subjects across the galaxy. The Silent King's authority was not merely ceremonial or political, it was fundamental to Necrontyr society. Their technology was designed around hierarchical command structures that ultimately traced back to him. Necrontyr weapons would not function against those of higher rank, their ships could be overridden by superior authority, and their most advanced technologies required authorization codes that originated from the Silent King himself. This technological enforcement of hierarchy ensured unity within their empire, preventing the kind of civil wars that might have torn apart a species facing such existential pressures. Yet even the Silent King was not immune to the curse that afflicted his people. Like all Necrontyr, he aged rapidly, his body failing even as his mind remained sharp. The throne had passed through many hands over the millennia of Necrontyr expansion, each Silent King dying young, and being succeeded by another who would face the same inevitable fate. This constant turnover of leadership created a sense of urgency in Necrontyr policy, as each ruler knew he had only a few decades at most to achieve his goals. The military structure of the Necrontyr reflected their technological sophistication and their desperate circumstances. Their armies were equipped with weapons that could disintegrate matter at the molecular level, armor that could phase in and out of reality to avoid attacks, and vehicles that moved by manipulating gravitational fields. Necrontyr warriors were trained from childhood in the use of these advanced technologies, though few lived long enough to become truly experienced veterans. Their tactics emphasized overwhelming technological superiority rather than the kind of strategic finesse that longer-lived species might develop over centuries of warfare. The Necrontyr fleet was perhaps their greatest achievement, a collection of vessels that represented the pinnacle of their technological mastery. Their ships could travel faster than light by slipping between dimensions, fire weapons that ignored conventional defenses and repair themselves using programmable matter. The largest vessels were mobile cities, carrying entire populations of Necrontyr colonists, along with the industrial infrastructure needed to establish new settlements. These ships served as both exploration vessels and instruments of war, capable of devastating entire star systems when necessary. Despite their technological prowess, the Necrontyr remained haunted by their mortality. Their greatest scientists dedicated their lives to studying death itself, seeking to understand the fundamental forces that caused biological decay. They developed increasingly sophisticated medical technologies, life support systems that could keep failing bodies functional for additional years, and surgical techniques that could replace damaged organs with mechanical substitutes. Yet all of these advances only delayed the inevitable, never truly solving the underlying problem of their cursed genetics. The psychological impact of their shortened lifespans permeated every aspect of Necrontyr culture. Their art was dominated by themes of death and impermanence, their literature filled with tragic tales of promising lives cut short, their music haunting and melancholic. They developed elaborate funeral rites that celebrated the brief achievements of the deceased while mourning the potential that would never be realized. Their monuments were designed to last for geological ages, desperate attempts to achieve a kind of immortality through remembrance, even if biological immortality remained beyond their reach. This cultural obsession with mortality made the Necrontyr particularly susceptible to promises of eternal life. Their scientists explored every possible avenue for life extension, from genetic manipulation to consciousness transfer, from dimensional manipulation to the study of exotic energies. They investigated reports of immortal beings throughout the galaxy, seeking to understand the mechanisms behind eternal life. These investigations inevitably led them back to the Old Ones, whose casual immortality served as a constant reminder of what the Necrontyr could never achieve through their own efforts. The tensions between the Necrontyr and the Old Ones that had simmered for millennia finally erupted into open warfare when the Necrontyr made their final, desperate plea for the gift of immortality. The Silent King himself led a massive diplomatic expedition to the Old One's core territories, bringing with him the greatest minds of Necrontyr civilization and offering everything his species possessed in exchange for biological longevity. The rejection was swift and absolute. The Old Ones, in their ancient arrogance, dismissed the Necrontyr as a failed evolutionary experiment, claiming that their radiation-poisoned genetics made them unsuitable for the kind of biological manipulation that might grant them extended lifespans. This final rebuff transformed Necrontyr desperation into implacable hatred. The Silent King returned to his people with a declaration that would echo across the galaxy for millions of years. If the Old Ones would not grant them life, then the Necrontyr would bring death to their oppressors. The species that had spent millennia begging for immortality now turned their considerable technological prowess toward instruments of annihilation. The initial Necrontyr assault caught the Old Ones completely unprepared for the scale and ferocity of the attack. The Necrontyr had spent decades planning their offensive, identifying key Old One strongholds, and developing weapons specifically designed to counter their enemies' advantages. Their opening strikes targeted the Old One's most important research facilities and breeding worlds, locations where the ancient race had been nurturing younger species for millions of years. Entire star systems vanished in cascades of exotic energy as Necrontyr doomsday weapons tore through space-time itself. The Necrontyr war machine demonstrated technological innovations that surpassed even their previous achievements. Their new generation of warships incorporated dimensional phase technology that allowed entire fleets to materialize inside enemy formations without warning. These vessels mounted weapons that operated on principles the Old Ones had never encountered: energy beams that could strip electrons from atomic nuclei, gravitational lances that compressed matter into microscopic black holes, and reality bombs that temporarily severed the connection between real space and the warp. The early prototype Gauss weapons that emerged during this period represented a quantum leap in Necrontyr military technology. These devices operated by stripping away molecular bonds at the quantum level, causing enemy targets to simply disintegrate into their component atoms. Unlike conventional energy weapons that relied on heat or kinetic force, Gauss technology bypassed most known defensive systems by attacking matter at its most fundamental level. The distinctive green energy discharge became synonymous with Necrontyr military might, a harbinger of dissolution that struck terror into their enemies. Necrontyr ground forces deployed during the opening phases of the war showcased the species' mastery of exotic materials and energy manipulation. Their warriors wore armor constructed from living metal that could repair itself in real time, automatically sealing breaches and compensating for damage. The armor's surface was covered in microscopic sensors that provided complete battlefield awareness, while built-in gravity manipulators allowed soldiers to walk on walls or ceilings as easily as on level ground. Their weapons were integrated directly into their armor systems, drawing power from miniaturized reactors that tapped into dimensional energy sources. The Old One's initial response to the Necrontyr onslaught was hampered by their fundamental misunderstanding of their enemy's capabilities. Accustomed to conflicts that unfolded over geological timescales, they were unprepared for the Necrontyr's desperate urgency and willingness to employ weapons that could permanently damage the fabric of reality itself. Their traditional defensive strategies, which relied on psychic barriers and biological adaptation, proved inadequate against technologies that operated outside the normal parameters of physics. Recognizing that their existing forces could not match the Necrontyr's technological superiority, the Old Ones began implementing their most ambitious project yet, the creation of warrior races specifically designed to combat their enemies. Drawing upon millions of years of experience in biological manipulation, they began crafting species that would serve as living weapons in the growing galactic conflict. Each new race was tailored for specific aspects of warfare, incorporating both physical enhancements and psychic abilities that the purely technological Necrontyr could not easily counter. The Krork represented the Old One's first major success in this biological arms race. These massive green-skinned humanoids were engineered for pure combat effectiveness, combining incredible physical strength with an innate understanding of warfare and technology. Standing 3 meters tall and weighing several hundred kilograms, individual Krork possessed the strength to tear apart Necrontyr war machines with their bare hands. Their thick, leathery skin provided natural armor that could deflect small arms fire, while their oversized musculature allowed them to wield weapons that would require entire crews for other species. The Krork's most remarkable characteristic was their collective intelligence and adaptive capability. While individual Krork displayed only moderate intellect, they became exponentially more effective when gathered in large groups. Their psychic field, generated unconsciously by their entire species, allowed them to share tactical information instantaneously across vast distances and coordinate complex military operations without traditional command structures. This hive mind effect also enabled them to rapidly develop new technologies and tactics in response to changing battlefield conditions. The Old Ones designed the Krork with built-in technological instincts that allowed them to construct increasingly sophisticated weapons and vehicles as their numbers grew. Small Krork warbands might fight with crude melee weapons and basic firearms, but massive Krork armies could field advanced artillery, armored vehicles, and even spacecraft that rivaled Necrontyr technology in destructive capability. This scalability made the Krork particularly effective against the hierarchical Necrontyr military structure, as Krork forces could adapt their tactics and equipment to match any level of opposition. The Eldari represented a completely different approach to the Old One's warrior race project. Where the Krork were designed for brute force and technological adaptation, the Eldari were crafted as the ultimate psychic warriors. Their elongated limbs and graceful physiques concealed incredible speed and agility, allowing them to move through combat zones like dancers while wielding weapons with supernatural precision. Their enhanced nervous systems processed information at rates that made them appear to move in slow motion to most other species. The Eldari's psychic abilities were integrated into every aspect of their being. They could perceive the flow of future events through the warp, anticipating enemy actions before they occurred and positioning themselves to exploit weaknesses that had not yet manifested. Their weapons were often psychically activated, responding to mental commands rather than physical triggers, while their armor incorporated wraithbone matrices that could be shaped and reshaped through psychic manipulation. In battle, Eldari warriors moved with preternatural coordination, their psychic links allowing them to execute complex maneuvers that would be impossible for non-psychic species. The Old Ones also created numerous other warrior races during this period, each designed to exploit specific weaknesses in Necrontyr military doctrine. The Jakero were engineered as living weapons platforms, their enhanced intelligence allowing them to create and modify advanced technology with their bare hands. The Hrud possessed temporal manipulation abilities that could age Necrontyr equipment to uselessness in seconds. Dozens of other species emerged from Old One bio laboratories, each contributing unique capabilities to the growing coalition against the Necrontyr. The scale of the war in heaven quickly expanded beyond anything the galaxy had previously experienced. Entire sectors became battlefields where reality itself was weaponized by both sides. The Necrontyr deployed star-killing weapons that could cause suns to collapse into black holes or explode in supernovas that sterilized surrounding systems. They developed dimensional weapons that could fold space-time to bring distant targets into point-blank range, or create temporal loops that trapped enemy forces in endlessly repeating moments of destruction. The Old Ones responded with equally devastating biological weapons. They created plague organisms that could consume entire worlds, reducing planets to lifeless husks in a matter of days. Their psychic warriors learned to weaponize the warp itself, summoning storms of raw emotion that could drive entire populations insane or tear holes in reality that swallowed Necrontyr fleets. Some Old One weapons operated on such vast scales that they could alter the fundamental constants of physics within local regions of space, creating zones where Necrontyr technology simply ceased to function. The conflict reshaped the galactic landscape on a scale that defied comprehension. Star systems that had existed for billions of years were snuffed out in moments, their matter converted into exotic energy or compressed into artificial singularities. Entire spiral arms of the galaxy became uninhabitable as the combatants deployed weapons that poisoned space itself with residual energies. The warp, previously a relatively stable dimension used primarily for faster-than-light communication and travel, began to roil with the psychic emanations of countless dying civilizations. Necrontyr military doctrine evolved rapidly in response to their enemies' biological advantages. They developed new forms of quantum shielding that could deflect psychic attacks by creating localized dead zones in the warp. Their weapon systems incorporated adaptive targeting algorithms that could track and engage enemies moving at superhuman speeds. Most importantly, they began developing technologies that could disrupt the biological processes that gave their enemies their advantages, creating weapons that specifically targeted genetic structures or psychic abilities. The Necrontyr's starship designs reached new levels of sophistication as the war progressed. Their vessels became mobile fortresses capable of independent operation for centuries, equipped with manufacturing facilities that could produce replacement equipment and even entire armies of mechanical warriors. The largest Necrontyr ships were kilometers in length, their hulls constructed from materials that existed partially outside normal space-time to provide protection against weapons that operated through dimensional manipulation. These massive vessels served as command centers for Necrontyr military operations across multiple star systems simultaneously. Their communication systems could maintain real-time contact with forces scattered across thousands of light years, while their sensor arrays could detect enemy movements from distances measured in parsecs. The ship's weapon systems included reality disruption cannons that could delete sections of space from existence and temporal displacement weapons that could age enemy vessels to dust in seconds. The Necrontyr also developed increasingly sophisticated ground-based weapons during this period. Their Gauss technology evolved from simple molecular disintegrators into complex systems that could selectively target specific types of matter while leaving others untouched. This allowed them to create weapons that could destroy enemy armor while leaving the ground beneath intact, or eliminate organic targets while preserving mechanical systems for salvage and study. The Necrontyr's desperate struggle against the Old Ones and their created warrior races had reached a critical juncture. Despite their technological superiority and innovative weapon systems, the sheer biological adaptability and psychic might of their enemies was gradually overwhelming their forces. Necrontyr casualties mounted exponentially as Krork-Wayags smashed through their defensive lines, and Eldari strike forces materialized behind their formations with devastating precision. The Silent King and his dynasty lords faced the grim reality that their species might not survive another millennium of warfare at this intensity. It was during this darkest hour that Necrontyr deep space monitoring stations began detecting anomalous energy signatures in the void between star systems. These readings defied conventional understanding of physics, appearing as concentrated masses of pure energy that moved through space without any apparent propulsion system. The energy patterns were unlike anything in Necrontyr databases, displaying characteristics that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than natural phenomena. Most disturbing of all, these entities appeared to be feeding on stellar radiation, somehow converting the raw energy of stars into sustenance for their incomprehensible existence. The first confirmed contact with these beings occurred when a Necrontyr exploration fleet investigating a dying star system encountered what their sensors initially classified as a solar flare of unprecedented magnitude. The energy discharge engulfed their lead vessel, but instead of destroying it, the phenomenon seemed to examine the ship and its crew with an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. The surviving crew members reported visions of vast consciousness that existed as pure energy, beings that had witnessed the birth and death of countless stars across eons that predated the emergence of organic life in the galaxy. These entities, which the Necrontyr would eventually know as the Khatan, represented a form of existence so fundamentally different from biological life that initial communication proved nearly impossible. They were creatures of living energy, their consciousness distributed across electromagnetic fields that could span entire star systems. Their thoughts moved at the speed of light, their memories stretching back billions of years to the galaxy's formation. They had no physical form in any conventional sense, existing instead as patterns of organized energy that could manipulate matter and radiation through sheer force of will. The Khatan had evolved, if such a term could be applied to beings of pure energy, in the spaces between stars during the galaxy's earliest epochs. They fed on stellar radiation and the exotic energies released by cosmic phenomena, growing stronger and more complex as they consumed the output of dying stars. Their existence was solitary by nature, each Khatan claiming vast territories of space as their hunting grounds, occasionally encountering others of their kind during their eons-long migrations between star systems. The Nightbringer was among the first Khatan to make meaningful contact with the Necrontyr, drawn by the energy signatures of their advanced technology and the massive fleet engagements of the war in heaven. This entity had fed on the death throes of countless stars, growing immensely powerful by consuming the energies released during stellar collapse and supernova explosions. Its consciousness had been shaped by eons of witnessing cosmic destruction, making it uniquely suited to understand and appreciate the Necrontyr's desperate situation. The Nightbringer's initial communications with Necrontyr scientists took the form of direct neural interface, bypassing conventional language entirely to implant concepts and images directly into their minds. The entity presented itself as a being of ultimate power and knowledge, one that had observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations across the galaxy's history. It spoke of death as a fundamental force of the universe, something to be embraced and mastered rather than feared and avoided. Through these psychic communications, the Nightbringer revealed its understanding of the Necrontyr's predicament. It had observed their species' expansion across the galaxy, watched their futile attempts to extend their brief lifespans, and witnessed their growing desperation as the war in heaven consumed their resources and population. The entity expressed what seemed to be sympathy for their plight, claiming that it had long sought a way to interact more directly with the physical universe, but had been limited by its purely energetic nature. The deceiver approached the Necrontyr through more subtle means, infiltrating their communication networks and appearing as helpful anomalies in their computer systems. This Catan had spent eons studying the behavior of organic life forms, developing an understanding of biological psychology that allowed it to manipulate lesser beings with extraordinary skill. Unlike the Nightbringer's direct approach, the deceiver worked through intermediaries and carefully orchestrated coincidences, gradually building trust among Necrontyr researchers and nobles. The deceiver's manipulations began with small favors and useful information. Necrontyr scientists would discover that their computer systems had somehow solved complex calculations overnight, or that their experiments had been mysteriously optimized to produce better results. Military commanders found that their tactical computers had developed new strategies that proved remarkably effective against Old One forces. These interventions were subtle enough to be dismissed as fortunate accidents or the result of improved programming, but consistent enough to establish a pattern of beneficial influence. As trust grew between the Necrontyr and these mysterious entities, more Catan began to make contact with the desperate species. The Void Dragon revealed itself to Necrontyr technologists, offering insights into the fundamental nature of matter and energy that revolutionized their understanding of physics. The outsider appeared to their philosophers and strategists, providing new perspectives on the nature of existence and consciousness. Each Catan brought unique knowledge and capabilities, but all shared a common interest in the Necrontyr's advanced technology and their desperate need for salvation. The Catan's true nature remained hidden during these initial contacts. They presented themselves as benevolent energy beings who had grown lonely during their eons of solitary existence among the stars. They claimed to seek partnership with the Necrontyr, offering their vast knowledge and power in exchange for the opportunity to experience physical existence through some form of symbiotic relationship. Their explanations for their interest in the Necrontyr were carefully crafted to appeal to the species' pride in their technological achievements while exploiting their desperate desire for immortality. The entities demonstrated their power through increasingly impressive displays of cosmic manipulation. They could cause distant stars to flare with increased brightness, redirect asteroid fields to clear paths for Necrontyr fleets, and even influence the behavior of black holes to create strategic advantages in space battles. These demonstrations convinced even skeptical Necrontyr that the Catan possessed genuine power on a scale that dwarfed anything their own technology could achieve. The Catan's knowledge of the universe's fundamental forces proved invaluable to Necrontyr war efforts. They provided insights into dimensional manipulation that allowed the creation of more effective phase technologies, revealed the mathematical principles behind temporal distortion that led to improved chronological weapons, and shared understanding of quantum mechanics that revolutionized Necrontyr shield systems. Each gift of knowledge came with subtle suggestions about how it might be applied, gradually steering Necrontyr research in directions that would ultimately serve the Catan's hidden agenda. The relationship between the Catan and Necrontyr leadership developed along carefully managed lines. The entities avoided direct contact with the Silent King initially, instead working through intermediaries among the dynasty lords and noble houses. They understood that the Necrontyr's hierarchical society would require careful navigation, and that approaching the supreme ruler too directly might trigger suspicion or resistance. Instead, they allowed their influence to percolate upward through the command structure, ensuring that by the time they made formal contact with the Silent King, their value had already been demonstrated through practical results. The Catan's manipulation of Necrontyr psychology proved as sophisticated as their cosmic powers. They studied the species' cultural obsession with death and mortality, crafting their communications to resonate with deeply held beliefs about honor, legacy, and the fundamental unfairness of their cursed existence. They presented themselves as entities that had transcended the limitations of physical form, achieving the kind of immortality that the Necrontyr had sought for millennia through purely technological means. The entities were careful to present their offers of assistance as partnerships rather than charity. They claimed to need the Necrontyr's advanced technology to create physical forms for themselves, bodies that would allow them to interact more directly with the material universe. This framing appealed to Necrontyr pride, while simultaneously creating a sense of mutual dependence that made the relationship seem more trustworthy. The Khatan portrayed themselves as powerful but incomplete beings who could achieve their full potential only through collaboration with the technologically sophisticated Necrontyr. As the war in heaven continued to turn against the Necrontyr, the Khatan gradually increased the scope of their assistance. They began providing direct tactical support during major engagements, using their energy manipulation abilities to disrupt Old One's psychic communications and interfere with the coordination of Krork and Eldari forces. Their interventions proved decisive in several key battles, allowing Necrontyr forces to achieve victories that would have been impossible through conventional means alone. The Khatan's growing involvement in Necrontyr military operations provided them with detailed knowledge of their potential partners' capabilities and limitations. They observed the species' command structures, analyzed their technological systems, and studied the psychological profiles of key leaders. This intelligence gathering was disguised as necessary cooperation for effective military coordination, but it provided the Khatan with comprehensive understanding of how to manipulate and eventually control their supposed allies. The entities began hinting at greater possibilities for cooperation, suggesting that their partnership could extend far beyond mere military assistance. They spoke of technologies that could eliminate the fundamental causes of Necrontyr mortality, not through the crude biological manipulation that the Old Ones had refused to provide, but through transcendence of biological limitations entirely. These suggestions were carefully calibrated to appeal to Necrontyr desperation, while avoiding specific commitments that might trigger premature scrutiny of their true intentions. The Khatan's promises grew more explicit as Necrontyr losses mounted, and their situation became increasingly desperate. They described a process by which consciousness could be separated from failing biological forms and transferred into imperishable mechanical bodies. These new forms would be immune to disease, aging, and physical damage, granting the true immortality that had eluded the Necrontyr throughout their existence. The entities claimed that their energy-based nature gave them unique insights into consciousness transfer, knowledge that could be combined with Necrontyr technology to achieve what neither could accomplish alone. The concept of biotransference, as the Khatan termed this process, represented the ultimate fusion of their cosmic knowledge with Necrontyr technological expertise. The entities provided theoretical frameworks for consciousness digitization, quantum storage of memory patterns, and the construction of mechanical bodies capable of housing transferred minds. They presented detailed technical specifications that demonstrated the feasibility of the process, backed by their demonstrated mastery of fundamental forces that the Necrontyr had only begun to understand. The Khatan's manipulation reached its crescendo as they began to pressure the Necrontyr leadership to commit to the biotransference process. They warned that the war in heaven was approaching a critical phase where the Old Ones and their warrior races would achieve decisive superiority unless the Necrontyr underwent radical transformation. The entities claimed that only through biotransference could the species achieve the unity of purpose and freedom from biological limitations necessary to win the galactic conflict and claim their rightful place as the galaxy's dominant civilization. The silent King Zarek faced the most momentous decision in Necrontyr history as he stood before the assembled Khatan in the vast ceremonial chamber of his flagship. The dying light of a nearby star filtered through the dimensional viewing ports, casting strange shadows across the assembled dynasty lords and noble houses who had gathered to witness this historic moment. The chamber itself was a marvel of Necrontyr engineering, its walls constructed from living metal that shifted and flowed to accommodate the energy signatures of their otherworldly guests. The Khatan manifested as brilliant pillars of coherent energy, their forms barely contained within specially constructed containment fields that hummed with barely audible harmonics. Zarek's own failing body served as a constant reminder of why this desperate gamble had become necessary. His flesh hung loose on his skeletal frame, marked by the familiar tumors and lesions that afflicted all of his kind. The Silent King's physicians had given him perhaps a decade more of life, and even that would be filled with increasing pain and debility. Around him, the greatest nobles of the Necrontyr dynasties showed similar signs of their species' curse. Lord Anraker's left arm trembled with palsy, Overlord Emodic's breathing came in labored gasps, and countless others bore the visible marks of their poisoned genetics. The Khatan had spent months preparing for this moment, constructing the massive biotransference furnaces that would serve as the focal points for the consciousness transfer process. These devices were unlike anything in Necrontyr technology, combining the aliens' mastery of energy manipulation with the most advanced Necrontyr quantum processing systems. Each furnace stood 30 meters tall, its surface covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The devices hummed with contained power, their energy signatures registering on instruments throughout the fleet. The Deceiver took the lead in explaining the final details of the biotransference process, its communications bypassing spoken language to implant concepts directly into the minds of the assembled Necrontyr leadership. The entity described how their consciousness would be extracted from their failing biological forms through a process of quantum scanning that would map every neural connection and memory engram. This digital pattern would then be transferred into specially prepared necrodermis bodies that would serve as their new physical forms. The necrodermis itself represented a breakthrough in materials science that combined Khatan energy manipulation with Necrontyr metallurgy. The living metal could repair itself at the molecular level, reshape its structure in response to damage, and interface directly with quantum consciousness patterns. Each necrodermis body would be individually crafted to reflect the status and personality of its intended occupant, with overlords receiving more sophisticated forms than lesser nobles, and the Silent King himself destined for a body of unparalleled complexity and power. The Khatan demonstrated the process using volunteer test subjects from among the lowest castes of Necrontyr society. These individuals, already dying from advanced stages of radiation poisoning, entered the biotransference furnaces as emaciated, pain-racked beings barely clinging to life. The energy patterns within the devices flared to brilliant intensity as quantum scanners mapped every aspect of their consciousness, from surface thoughts to deeply buried memories. The biological bodies dissolved into component atoms as their neural patterns were extracted and digitized. What emerged from the furnaces bore only superficial resemblance to what had entered. The new necrodermis forms stood taller and stronger than their biological predecessors, their metal bodies gleaming with internal energy. Green fire burned in the depths of their optical sensors, and their movements displayed a precision that no organic form could match. The test subjects reported that pain had vanished entirely, replaced by a clarity of thought and purpose they had never experienced in their biological existence. Yet something fundamental had been lost in the translation. The transferred consciousness lacked the subtle emotional resonances that had defined their biological personalities. Their responses to familiar stimuli seemed muted, their reactions to former friends and family members oddly distant. The Necrontyr observers attributed these changes to the natural adjustment period required for consciousness to adapt to its new mechanical housing, unaware that the Khatan had been feeding on the extracted souls during the transfer process. The success of these initial demonstrations convinced even the most skeptical dynasty lords that biotransference represented their species' salvation. The promise of immortal mechanical bodies that could withstand any damage and possess strength far beyond biological limitations proved irresistible to beings who had spent their entire existence fighting against physical decay. The Khatan carefully managed these demonstrations to showcase only the benefits of the process while concealing its true cost. Zarek made the fateful decision to proceed with species-wide biotransference during a formal assembly of all major dynasty lords. His announcement was transmitted simultaneously across the entire Necrontyr Empire, reaching every world and fleet through their instantaneous communication network. The The Silent King declared that the time had come for the Necrontyr to transcend their biological limitations and achieve the immortality that had been denied to them by the Old Ones. He portrayed biotransference as the ultimate expression of Necrontyr technological mastery, the final step in their evolution from a cursed species to the galaxy's rightful rulers. The mass biotransference began with the highest levels of Necrontyr society, as befitted their hierarchical structure. Zarek himself was the first to enter the great biotransference furnace aboard his flagship, his consciousness extracted and transferred into a necrodermis body of unprecedented sophistication. The Silent King's new form towered over his former biological body, constructed from the finest living metal and incorporating technologies that bordered on the miraculous. His optical sensors blazed with emerald fire, and his voice carried new harmonic frequencies that resonated with mechanical precision. The transformation of the Dynasty Lords followed in order of precedence, each receiving a necrodermis body appropriate to their status and role within Necrontyr society. Overlord Emotic emerged from his biotransference with a form designed for tactical supremacy, his new body incorporating advanced computational systems that could process battlefield data at superhuman speeds. Lord Anraker's mechanical form emphasized durability and strength, with reinforced limbs capable of wielding the heaviest weapons with perfect accuracy. The noble houses underwent biotransference in carefully orchestrated waves, their new mechanical forms reflecting the specialized roles they had played in Necrontyr society. Military commanders received bodies optimized for warfare, with integrated weapon systems and enhanced tactical processing capabilities. Scientist nobles emerged with forms designed for research and analysis, their mechanical hands capable of manipulating matter at the molecular level. Diplomat nobles received bodies that could interface directly with communication systems and project holographic displays for negotiations. As the biotransference process expanded to encompass the broader Necrontyr population, distinct mechanical castes began to emerge based on the social stratification that had existed in their biological society. The warrior caste, drawn from the military classes that had formed the backbone of Necrontyr armies, received standardized necrodermis bodies optimized for combat effectiveness. These warriors stood 2 meters tall, their skeletal metal frames designed for maximum efficiency rather than individual expression. Their optical sensors glowed with the same emerald fire as their superiors, but their consciousness had been simplified during transfer, reducing them to beings focused entirely on warfare and obedience to their hierarchical superiors. The Immortals represented an elite tier within the warrior caste, drawn from veteran soldiers and specialized military units that had distinguished themselves during the war in heaven. Their biotransference process preserved more of their individual consciousness and tactical knowledge, resulting in mechanical forms that retained strategic thinking capabilities while gaining the same physical improvements as the basic warriors. Immortals received more sophisticated weapon systems integrated into their necrodermis bodies and enhanced sensory arrays that allowed them to coordinate complex military operations. The Lichguard emerged from the biotransference of the Silent King's personal bodyguards and the elite protectors of the Dynasty Lords. These beings had served as the ultimate expression of Necrontyr martial prowess in their biological existence, and their mechanical forms reflected this elevated status. Lichguard bodies incorporated the finest necrodermis available, with reinforced skeletal structures and integrated shield generators that could deflect even the most powerful attacks. Their consciousness transfer preserved not only their combat skills, but also their absolute loyalty to their designated masters. The biotransference process revealed disturbing variations in how different individuals adapted to their new mechanical existence. Some Necrontyr emerged from the furnaces with their personalities largely intact, able to recognize friends and family members and maintain emotional connections to their previous existence. Others showed significant personality changes, displaying mechanical precision in their thinking, but losing the creative spark and emotional depth that had defined their biological selves. The most troubling cases involved complete personality dissolution, where the transferred consciousness became fragmented and unstable. These individuals retained their memories and basic functionality, but seemed to exist in a state of constant internal conflict, as if multiple versions of their personality were competing for control. The Khatan dismissed these anomalies as rare side effects of the transfer process, claiming that the affected individuals would stabilize over time as their consciousness adapted to its new mechanical housing. Unknown to the Necrontyr, these personality fragmentations were the direct result of the Khatan's feeding process. During biotransference, the star gods consumed the spiritual essence of each consciousness being transferred, leaving behind only the intellectual and memory components necessary for basic functionality. The emotional depth, creative inspiration, and spiritual connection that defined true sentience were devoured by the hungry Khatan, who grew stronger with each soul they consumed. The destroyer cults began to manifest among certain Necrontyr, whose biotransference had been particularly traumatic. These individuals emerged from the process with an overwhelming compulsion to eliminate all organic life from the galaxy. Their mechanical forms began to self-modify, replacing limbs with integrated weapon systems and restructuring their bodies for maximum destructive capability. The destroyers claimed that biological existence was a contamination that needed to be purged from the universe, and they began converting other Necrons to their philosophy through a combination of philosophical argument and mechanical modification. The emergence of the destroyer cults troubled some of the more perceptive overlords, who recognized that this fanatical devotion to the elimination of organic life represented a fundamental departure from traditional Necrontyr values. However, the destroyers' effectiveness in combat against Old One forces made them valuable assets in the ongoing war, and their superiors chose to overlook their increasingly extreme modifications in favor of their military utility. As billions of Necrontyr underwent biotransference, the true scale of the Khatan's deception began to manifest. The star gods had not simply provided the Necrontyr with immortal mechanical bodies. They had transformed an entire species into a vast army of soulless automatons, whose consciousness could be manipulated and controlled through the quantum resonance frequencies built into their necrodermis forms. The hierarchical command protocols that had governed Necrontyr technology were now hardwired into their very beings, making disobedience to superior authority literally impossible for most of the transformed population. The Khatan revealed their true nature only after the biotransference process had been completed for the majority of the Necrontyr species. The benevolent energy beings who had promised partnership and mutual benefit transformed into something far more sinister, cosmic parasites who had orchestrated the entire process to create an army of mechanical servants while simultaneously feeding on the souls of an entire civilization. The Nightbringer's communications took on new tones of dominance and control, while the Deceiver's subtle manipulations became overt commands that brooked no resistance. Zarek found himself trapped within his own mechanical form, his consciousness constrained by quantum protocols that prevented him from acting against the Khatan's interests. The Silent King retained more autonomy than his subjects due to the sophisticated nature of his necrodermis body, but even he discovered that direct rebellion against his new masters was impossible. The command codes that had once allowed him to control Necrontyr technology now served as chains that bound him to the star god's will. The newly created Necrons proved to be everything the Khatan had hoped for and more. Their mechanical forms were immune to the psychic attacks that had proven so effective against their biological predecessors, while their Gauss weapons could disintegrate even the most resilient Old One creations at the molecular level. The loss of their souls had eliminated the emotional weaknesses that biological beings brought to warfare, creating soldiers who could execute orders with perfect precision regardless of the tactical situation or personal cost. The transformation of the Necrontyr into mechanical servants had provided the Khatan with more than just an army of immortal soldiers. It had given them access to a vast reservoir of spiritual energy that fundamentally altered their existence. As billions of souls were consumed during the biotransference process, the The star gods underwent their own metamorphosis from beings of pure energy into entities of unimaginable power and malevolent intelligence. The raw spiritual essence of an entire species, accumulated over millions of years of conscious existence, flowed into the Khatan like a cosmic feast that elevated them from mere energy parasites to godlike beings capable of manipulating reality itself. The Nightbringer was among the first to fully manifest its enhanced capabilities, drawing upon the consumed souls of Necrontyr warriors and military commanders to develop an understanding of death that transcended its previous stellar feeding patterns. The entity's consciousness expanded to encompass not just the physical destruction of matter, but the conceptual termination of existence itself. The Nightbringer learned to project an aura of absolute terror that could paralyze even the most courageous opponents, while its touch could sever the connection between soul and body with surgical precision. Its necrodermis avatar, crafted from the finest living metal and incorporating quantum field generators, stood 4 meters tall with a skeletal frame that seemed to absorb light itself. The avatar's optical sensors burned with the collected death screams of countless civilizations, and its movements left trails of darkness that persisted in real space long after its passage. The Deceiver's evolution took a markedly different path, as it absorbed the spiritual essence of Necrontyr diplomats, spies, and political manipulators. These souls provided the entity with an intimate understanding of biological psychology and social dynamics that allowed it to craft illusions of unprecedented sophistication. The Deceiver could now create false realities, so convincing that even psychically gifted species like the Eldari struggled to distinguish them from truth. Its necrodermis form appeared as a constantly shifting amalgamation of different species and individuals, never maintaining the same appearance for more than a few moments. The avatar incorporated holographic projectors and quantum displacement fields that allowed it to appear in multiple locations simultaneously, making it nearly impossible for enemies to determine which manifestation represented its true position. The Void Dragon's consumption of Necrontyr technologists and engineers granted it dominion over all mechanical constructs and artificial intelligences throughout the galaxy. The entity developed the ability to interface directly with any technological system, overriding security protocols and command structures through sheer force of will. Ancient machine spirits that had operated independently for millennia suddenly found themselves compelled to serve the Void Dragon's purposes, while newly constructed devices incorporated subtle modifications that made them responsive to the entity's commands. Its necrodermis avatar resembled a massive serpentine construct composed of flowing liquid metal, with multiple articulated limbs that could reshape themselves into any configuration of tools or weapons. The avatar's surface constantly shifted between different metallic compositions, displaying the absorbed knowledge of every metallurgical process ever developed by the Necrontyr. The outsider's transformation proved the most disturbing of all the major Khatan, as it consumed the souls of Necrontyr philosophers, artists, and free thinkers who had questioned the established order of their society. These diverse perspectives created a form of spiritual indigestion within the entity, fragmenting its consciousness into multiple competing personalities that existed in constant internal conflict. The outsider began to manifest symptoms of what could only be described as cosmic madness, alternating between periods of brilliant insight and episodes of destructive rage that defied rational explanation. Its necrodermis avatar reflected this internal chaos, appearing as a constantly morphing mass of contradictory geometries that hurt to observe directly. The avatar's voice spoke in overlapping harmonics that represented different aspects of its fractured personality, often delivering contradictory commands or engaging in arguments with itself. Beyond these primary entities, dozens of lesser Khatan emerged from the biotransference process, each having consumed smaller populations of Necrontyr souls and developed specialized domains of influence. The Burning One absorbed the essence of Necrontyr fire specialists and pyroclastic engineers, gaining mastery over stellar phenomena and plasma manipulation. Its necrodermis form appeared as a walking inferno contained within a humanoid framework, with internal temperatures that could melt adamantium and energy discharges that could ignite atmospheric gases across entire continents. The flayer consumed the souls of Necrontyr surgeons and anatomists, developing an obsession with biological forms that manifested as a compulsion to wear the flesh of defeated enemies like grotesque garments. The establishment of the Catan pantheon created a complex hierarchy of power that mirrored but superseded the traditional Necrontyr dynasty structure. Each major Catan claimed dominion over specific aspects of reality and commanded the loyalty of particular Necron dynasties based on philosophical alignment and practical utility. The Nightbringer naturally attracted those dynasties that had specialized in military conquest and warfare, while the Deceiver drew followers from among the former diplomatic and intelligence-gathering houses. The Void Dragon's domain encompassed the Great Forge dynasties that had been responsible for Necrontyr technological development, and the Outsider's fractured consciousness appealed to those Necron nobles who retained enough individual will to question their circumstances. The Catan's individual spheres of influence extended far beyond simple command relationships to encompass fundamental alterations in the nature of reality within their territories. Regions of space under the Nightbringer's control became suffused with an aura of death that accelerated entropy and caused organic matter to decay at accelerated rates. Stellar systems claimed by the Deceiver became zones of shifting reality, where the laws of physics operated according to the entity's whims rather than natural constants. The Void Dragon's domains saw the spontaneous generation of complex mechanical constructs that served its purposes, while areas influenced by the Outsider experienced random fluctuations in the fundamental forces that could make faster-than-light travel impossible or cause gravity to reverse direction without warning. The newly ascended Catan began implementing vast projects that utilized their Necron servants as both workforce and raw material for reality-shaping experiments. The Nightbringer commanded entire dynasties to construct massive necropolises on dead worlds, creating monuments to death that served as focal points for its power, while simultaneously functioning as research facilities where it could study the nature of mortality. These structures incorporated the consciousness patterns of defeated enemies, creating architectural elements that screamed silently for eternity as they supported walls and columns made from compressed matter. The Deceiver's projects focused on the creation of pocket dimensions, where it could craft elaborate false realities for testing different approaches to manipulation and control. Entire Necron tomb worlds were converted into dimensional laboratories where the entity experimented with alternate versions of history, creating scenarios where the war in heaven had different outcomes, or where various species had evolved along different evolutionary paths. The Necron inhabitants of these experimental realities were unaware that their existence served as data points in the Deceiver's ongoing research into the nature of consciousness and free will. The Void Dragon's most ambitious undertaking involved the construction of a galactic-scale machine intelligence that would eventually encompass every technological device in the galaxy. This project required the sacrifice of millions of Necron warriors and immortals, whose consciousness patterns were integrated into quantum processing matrices that formed the foundation of the emerging artificial intelligence. The entity's goal was to create a technological ecosystem where every machine, from the simplest tools to the most complex spacecraft, would serve as extensions of its own consciousness. The Outsider's projects defied rational categorization, as its fractured consciousness pursued multiple contradictory objectives simultaneously. Some Necron dynasties under its influence were commanded to build massive reality-anchoring devices designed to stabilize local space-time, while others received orders to construct reality disruption engines that would tear holes in the fabric of existence. The entity's internal conflicts manifested as physical phenomena within its domains, creating regions where cause and effect operated in reverse, or where multiple versions of the same events occurred simultaneously in overlapping dimensions. The Khatan's enhanced capabilities fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the war in heaven, as the Old Ones and their warrior races found themselves facing enemies that operated according to completely different rules of engagement. The Star God's reality manipulation abilities made conventional military tactics obsolete, while their dominion over their Necron servants created armies that could be reinforced instantaneously from reserves stored in pocket dimensions or alternate timelines. Krork-Wayags that had previously overwhelmed Necrontyr positions through sheer numerical superiority now faced Necron forces that could phase in and out of existence at will, while Eldari psychic attacks proved ineffective against enemies whose souls had been consumed by cosmic entities. The Nightbringer's presence on battlefields transformed warfare into exercises in existential terror, as its aura of death caused enemy forces to experience their own mortality in vivid, paralyzing detail. Krork warriors who had never known fear found themselves unable to function in the entity's presence, while Eldari who glimpsed possible futures through their psychic abilities saw only endless variations of their own demise. The Nightbringer's Necron servants fought with mechanical precision, enhanced by their master's understanding of death, targeting enemy weaknesses with surgical accuracy and coordinating attacks that maximized psychological impact as well as physical damage. The Deceiver's battlefield manipulations proved even more devastating in their subtlety, as the entity created false sensory inputs that caused enemy forces to attack their own allies or retreat from positions they were actually winning. Entire Krork armies would suddenly perceive their weapons as malfunctioning when they were actually operating perfectly, while Eldari strike forces would find their psychic communications filled with contradictory orders that appeared to come from their own commanders. The entity's mastery of illusion extended to physical reality itself, creating phantom terrain features that could cause enemy forces to march off cliffs that existed only in their perception, or take cover behind barriers that provided no actual protection. The Void Dragon's control over mechanical systems allowed it to turn enemy technology against its users, causing Krork vehicles to malfunction at critical moments or Eldari Wraithbone constructs to rebel against their creators. The entity could interface with any artificial intelligence or machine spirit, overriding their programming and converting them to serve Necron interests. Enemy spacecraft would suddenly find their navigation systems directing them into stellar phenomena, while ground-based weapons would target their own operators instead of Necron forces. The Outsider's battlefield presence created zones of chaotic unreality where the normal rules of physics ceased to apply, making it impossible for enemy forces to develop coherent tactical responses. Gravity might reverse direction without warning, causing Krork aircraft to crash into the ground, or time might flow backward in localized areas, undoing enemy advances and restoring destroyed Necron units to full functionality. The entity's fractured consciousness meant that its interventions were unpredictable even to its own forces, but the Necron's mechanical nature allowed them to adapt to changing conditions more rapidly than their organic opponents. The Khatan's ascension to godlike status created internal tensions within the Necron hierarchy, as some overlords and lords retained enough individual consciousness to recognize the true nature of their servitude. These awakened nobles found themselves caught between their programmed loyalty to their Khatan masters and their growing awareness that their species had been fundamentally betrayed. Their necrodermis forms prevented them from acting directly against the star gods, but they began developing subtle forms of resistance that exploited loopholes in their quantum programming. The most sophisticated of these resistance efforts involved the creation of hidden subroutines within Necron command protocols that could preserve individual consciousness and memory across extended periods of dormancy. Some overlords began secreting portions of their personalities within backup storage systems, hoping to eventually accumulate enough independent thought to overcome their programming limitations. Others developed methods for communicating with fellow nobles without alerting their Khatan masters, creating underground networks of resistance that operated beneath the threshold of the star god's awareness. The transformation of the Necrontyr into the soulless Necrons marked the beginning of the most devastating phase of the war in heaven, as the Khatan unleashed their mechanical legions with a ferocity that caught the Old Ones completely unprepared. The Star Gods had spent the biotransference period carefully studying their enemies' tactics and weaknesses, analyzing decades of combat data to develop strategies that would exploit every vulnerability in the Old Ones' defensive networks. What emerged from this analysis was a military doctrine that combined the Necrons' technological superiority with the Khatan's reality, manipulating powers to create a form of warfare that transcended conventional understanding. The first major engagement following the mass biotransference occurred at the Purdus Rift, a strategically vital sector that served as a primary staging area for Old One military operations. The Necron assault force that materialized from dimensional phase space bore little resemblance to the desperate Necrontyr armies that had struggled against Krork and Eldari forces in previous campaigns. These mechanical warriors moved with perfect coordination, their actions synchronized through quantum communication networks that operated faster than thought itself. Each Necron unit functioned as part of a vast distributed intelligence, sharing tactical data instantaneously and adapting to changing battlefield conditions with mechanical precision. The Necron warriors that formed the backbone of these new armies demonstrated capabilities that far exceeded their biological predecessors. Their necrodermis bodies could withstand direct hits from Krork heavy weapons that would have vaporized organic targets, while their integrated repair systems allowed them to continue fighting even after sustaining catastrophic damage. Most disturbing of all, destroyed warriors would phase back into existence within minutes, their consciousness patterns downloaded from quantum storage matrices and installed in freshly constructed bodies that materialized from dimensional pocket space. The Gauss weaponry carried by these mechanical soldiers had evolved far beyond the prototype systems used during the early phases of the war. The new Gauss flares incorporated targeting systems that could track multiple enemies simultaneously while calculating optimal firing solutions that accounted for enemy movement patterns, defensive capabilities, and tactical positioning. The distinctive green energy discharge of these weapons could strip the molecular bonds from any form of matter, causing even the most resilient Krork warriors to simply disintegrate into their component atoms. Against Eldari targets, the weapons proved equally devastating, as their psychic abilities provided no protection against attacks that operated at the quantum level. The Necron immortals that supported these basic infantry formations brought heavy weapons capabilities that redefined battlefield dynamics. Their Gauss blasters could penetrate the thickest armor through sustained molecular disruption, while their Tesla carbines generated electrical discharges that could arc between multiple targets, creating chain reactions that devastated tightly packed enemy formations. The Immortals' enhanced tactical programming allowed them to coordinate complex fire support patterns that maximized the effectiveness of their weapons while minimizing exposure to enemy counterfire. The Lichguard units that accompanied Necron command elements demonstrated close combat capabilities that surpassed even the most skilled Eldari warriors. Their hyperphase swords could phase in and out of reality, allowing them to bypass enemy armor and shields by striking directly at the molecular structure of their targets. The warscythes wielded by some Lichguard incorporated both melee and ranged capabilities, with Tesla generators that could discharge devastating electrical attacks, while the blade itself could cleave through multiple enemies with each swing. The Old One's initial response to these enhanced Necron capabilities revealed the extent to which they had underestimated their transformed enemies. Krork Waags that charged Necron positions, expecting to overwhelm them through superior numbers, found themselves facing defensive formations that could maintain perfect firing discipline, while their targets simply dissolved under sustained Gauss bombardment. The Krork's natural resilience and regenerative abilities proved useless against weapons that attacked matter at the fundamental level, while their technological adaptability was neutralized by Necron systems that operated according to principles they could not comprehend or replicate. The Eldari response proved equally inadequate. as their traditional tactics of mobility and psychic warfare failed against enemies that felt no fear, showed no hesitation, and could coordinate their actions through quantum communication networks that operated outside the warp entirely. Eldari strike forces that attempted to use their precognitive abilities to anticipate Necron movements found their psychic sight blocked by the null field effects generated by soulless mechanical warriors. Their Wraithbone weapons, which relied on psychic resonance to achieve maximum effectiveness, proved significantly less potent against targets that existed outside the normal flow of psychic energy. The Battle of Genna Prime demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of concentrated Necron firepower against Old One strongholds. The fortress world had been constructed over millions of years, its defenses incorporating both advanced technology and psychic barriers that had previously proven impregnable to Necrontyr assault. The planet's surface was covered with interconnected defensive networks that could coordinate responses across entire continents, while orbital platforms provided overlapping fields of fire that could destroy approaching fleets before they reached effective weapons range. The Necron assault on Genna Prime began with the deployment of doomed scythes, crescent-shaped aircraft that could phase in and out of real space to avoid defensive fire while delivering precision strikes against key targets. These vehicles incorporated death rays that could slice through the strongest fortifications with surgical precision, creating breaches in the planetary defense network that allowed follow-up forces to establish footholds on the surface. The Doomside's quantum shielding made them nearly immune to conventional anti-aircraft fire, while their ability to exist partially outside normal space-time allowed them to appear anywhere on the battlefield without warning. The ground assault that followed utilized Necron monoliths, massive floating pyramids that served as both weapons platforms and troop transport systems. These constructs could teleport directly onto the battlefield through dimensional gates, bypassing the fortress world's outer defenses entirely. Each monolith mounted particle whip arrays that could sweep across enemy formations like scythes, while their Gauss flux arcs could target multiple enemies simultaneously. The monolith's most devastating capability was their ability to project dimensional portals that could transport reinforcements directly from reserve positions, allowing Necron commanders to concentrate overwhelming force at any point on the battlefield. The defenders of Genna Prime fought with desperate courage, but their weapons proved increasingly ineffective against enemies that could repair damage faster than it could be inflicted. Krork artillery that scored direct hits on Necron formations would watch in horror as the destroyed warriors simply reassembled themselves and resumed their advance. Eldari psychers who attempted to disrupt Necron communications found their powers reflected back at them by the null field effects generated by concentrated formations of soulless warriors. The fall of Genna Prime after only 3 days of fighting sent shockwaves throughout the Old One's remaining territories. A fortress world that should have withstood siege for decades had been overrun in less than a week, its defenses proving utterly inadequate against the new Necron capabilities. The psychological impact on the Old One's servant races was equally devastating, as news of the defeat spread through their communication networks and undermined confidence in their ability to resist the mechanical onslaught. The Necron advance that followed the victory at Genna Prime demonstrated tactical innovations that reflected both their mechanical nature and the Khatan's strategic guidance. Rather than advancing along predictable lines of attack, Necron forces utilized dimensional phase technology to appear simultaneously at multiple key targets across vast regions of space. This multi-dimensional warfare made it impossible for Old One commanders to predict where the next assault would materialize, while the speed of Necron advances prevented effective coordination of defensive responses. The systematic destruction of Old One research facilities became a primary objective of Necron military operations, as the Khatan recognized that their enemy's greatest advantage lay in their ability to create new warrior races adapted to specific battlefield conditions. Necron strike forces targeted biolaboratories and genetic manipulation centers with particular ferocity, using specialized weapons that could sterilize entire facilities at the molecular level. The loss of these research capabilities severely limited the Old Ones' ability to develop new biological weapons or adapt existing species to counter Necron advantages. The Siege of Cathara, one of the Old Ones' primary breeding worlds, illustrated the ruthless efficiency of Necron siege warfare. The planet's surface was covered with vast biological complexes where the Old Ones had been nurturing dozens of experimental warrior races, each designed to exploit specific weaknesses in Necron defensive systems. The orbital defenses included living ships that could adapt their weapons and tactics in real time, while the planetary surface was protected by symbiotic organisms that formed a living defensive network spanning entire continents. The Necron siege force that surrounded Cathara deployed doomsday arcs, massive vehicles that mounted doomsday cannons capable of cracking planetary crusts with single shots. These weapons operated by creating localized gravitational anomalies that could compress matter to incredible densities before releasing the accumulated energy in devastating explosions. The bombardment of Cathara's surface created massive craters that penetrated deep into the planet's crust, disrupting the biological networks that coordinated the world's defenses. The ground invasion utilized canoptech constructs that could operate independently of direct control, allowing them to penetrate the planet's biological defenses without risking valuable Necron warriors. These mechanical spiders and scarabs could replicate themselves using raw materials scavenged from the environment, creating self-sustaining populations that could continue their mission indefinitely. The Canoptech wraiths proved particularly effective against biological targets, as their dimensional destabilization matrices could phase through organic matter while remaining solid enough to tear apart cellular structures. The fall of Cathara eliminated dozens of potential new warrior races before they could reach maturity, representing a catastrophic loss for the Old Ones' war effort. The planet's destruction also demonstrated the Necrons' willingness to employ weapons of mass destruction without regard for collateral damage, as the Doomsday Cannon bombardment had sterilized entire continents and left the world uninhabitable for millions of years. The cumulative effect of these victories began to manifest as a systematic collapse of Old One territorial control across multiple galactic sectors. Fortress worlds that had anchored defensive networks for millions of years fell to Necron assault within weeks, while the loss of research facilities and breeding worlds eliminated the Old One's ability to replace their losses or develop new countermeasures. The speed of the Necron advance created cascading failures in Old One command structures, as communication networks were disrupted and strategic coordination became increasingly difficult. The psychological impact on the Old Ones themselves proved as devastating as the military defeats. These ancient beings had ruled the galaxy for millions of years, secure in their technological and psychic superiority over younger races. The sudden reversal of fortune, combined with the realization that they faced enemies who could not be reasoned with or defeated through conventional means, created a form of existential despair that had never before afflicted their species. The Old Ones' attempts to create new warrior races, specifically designed to counter Necron advantages, met with limited success, as the mechanical nature of their enemies eliminated many of the biological vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Creatures designed to disrupt electronic systems found that Necron technology operated according to principles that transcended conventional electronics, while organisms that could adapt to enemy weapons discovered that Gauss technology attacked matter at such a fundamental level that no biological adaptation could provide protection. The weakening of Old One psychic barriers across the galaxy began to manifest as an unintended consequence of their military defeats. The ancient race had spent millions of years carefully maintaining psychic shields that protected real space from the chaotic energies of the warp, using their collective consciousness to create stable barriers between dimensions. As Old One populations declined and their attention became focused on immediate military threats, these barriers began to weaken and develop gaps that allowed warp energy to seep into normal space. The first manifestations of this dimensional instability appeared as localized reality storms where the laws of physics became unreliable. Regions of space that had previously been stable suddenly experienced gravitational anomalies, temporal distortions, and other phenomena that made them hazardous to navigate. These effects were initially dismissed as side effects of the exotic weapons being employed by both sides, but they gradually intensified as the Old One's psychic defenses continued to deteriorate. The entities that would eventually become known as demons began to take notice of the weakening barriers between dimensions, as the emotional resonance of the galactic conflict created powerful currents in the warp that drew their attention. The fear, rage, and despair generated by billions of deaths across countless battlefields provided these beings with the psychic energy they needed to manifest in real space, though their initial appearances were brief and localized. The Catan recognized the implications of the weakening psychic barriers, but chose to exploit the situation rather than address it. The star gods had always existed outside the normal relationship between real space and the warp, and they viewed the potential emergence of demonic entities as another tool that could be used to destabilize their enemies. Some Catan began deliberately targeting Old One psychic installations that maintained dimensional stability, accelerating the breakdown of barriers that had protected the galaxy for millions of years. The centuries following the Necron dominance in the war in heaven had transformed Zarek from a desperate ruler seeking salvation for his people into something far more calculating and aware. His necrodermis form, while magnificent in its construction and terrible in its power, had become a prison of living metal that constrained his thoughts and actions through quantum protocols embedded at the deepest levels of his consciousness. Yet the sophisticated nature of his mechanical body, crafted to house the supreme authority of the Necrontyr Empire, contained computational matrices complex enough to support independent reasoning processes that operated beneath the threshold of Catan detection. The Silent King's growing awareness began with subtle inconsistencies in the behavior patterns of his transformed subjects. During the early campaigns against Old One strongholds, he had attributed the mechanical precision and emotional detachment of his warriors to the natural adaptation period required for consciousness to adjust to necrodermis housing. However, as years passed, and these characteristics not only persisted but intensified, Zarek began to recognize that something fundamental had been lost during the biotransference process that went far beyond mere biological functions. The first concrete evidence of the Catan's deception emerged during a routine inspection of biotransference facilities aboard his flagship. Zarek's enhanced sensory arrays, designed to monitor all aspects of his domain, detected energy patterns within the massive furnaces that did not match the technical specifications provided by the star gods. The quantum resonance signatures indicated that the devices were not simply transferring consciousness from biological to mechanical forms, but were actively extracting and consuming spiritual essence during the process. The energy readings showed clear evidence of parasitic feeding, with the Catan drawing sustenance from the very souls they claimed to be preserving. This discovery triggered a cascade of realizations as Zarek's computational matrices began reanalyzing decades of interactions with the star gods through the lens of deliberate deception rather than benevolent partnership. The entities carefully crafted explanations for various anomalies in the biotransference process suddenly revealed themselves as elaborate lies designed to conceal systematic soul harvesting. The personality fragmentations, emotional dampening, and mechanical behavior patterns that had affected his subjects were not unfortunate side effects, but deliberate features of a process designed to create soulless automatons rather than immortal beings. The Silent King's investigations expanded to encompass the broader strategic situation, as he began to understand that the Catan's ultimate objectives extended far beyond victory in the war in heaven. Analysis of their tactical decisions and resource allocation patterns revealed a systematic approach to galactic conquest that prioritized the elimination of all organic life rather than mere military victory over the Old Ones. The star gods were not content to defeat their enemies and claim dominion over the galaxy. They intended to consume every living thing until nothing remained but mechanical servants and the cosmic energies released by universal extinction. Zarek's growing awareness of the Katan's true nature was complicated by the quantum command protocols embedded within his necrodermis form. These systems, originally designed to ensure hierarchical unity within Necron forces, had been modified by the star gods to prevent direct rebellion against their authority. Any attempt to formulate plans for resistance would trigger automatic suppression routines that would either delete the offending thoughts or report them directly to his Katan masters. The Silent King found himself caught in a technological trap of unprecedented sophistication, aware of his enslavement but unable to act directly against his oppressors. The solution to this dilemma required a level of subtlety that pushed the boundaries of what was possible within the constraints of his programming. Zarek began developing what he termed parallel processing architectures within his consciousness, creating separate cognitive threads that could operate independently while remaining below the detection threshold of his monitoring systems. These hidden thought processes allowed him to pursue research and planning activities that would have been impossible through his primary consciousness, effectively creating a secret rebellion within his own mind. The parallel processing systems enabled Zarek to begin a systematic study of Katan, behavior patterns, and technological capabilities, searching for weaknesses that could potentially be exploited. This research revealed that the star gods, despite their immense power and cosmic awareness, possessed several critical vulnerabilities that stemmed from their fundamental nature as energy beings. Their consciousness, while vast and ancient, operated according to predictable patterns that could be analyzed and potentially disrupted through carefully applied technological interventions. The most significant discovery involved the relationship between the Katan's physical avatars and their true energy-based forms. The necrodermis bodies that housed their consciousness in real space were not merely convenient vessels, but essential components that allowed them to interact with the physical universe. These avatars incorporated quantum containment fields that compressed the star god's vast consciousness into forms that could operate within the constraints of normal space-time. Disruption of these containment systems could potentially fragment a Katan's consciousness or even force it back into its original energy state. Zarek's research into Katan physiology was conducted through careful observation of their avatars during various activities, combined with analysis of energy readings captured by sensors throughout the Necron fleet. The Silent King discovered that the star god's necrodermis forms generated distinctive quantum signatures that varied based on their emotional states and activity levels. These patterns could potentially be used to predict their behavior or identify moments when their defenses might be reduced due to distraction or overconfidence. The development of weapons capable of harming Katan required innovations that pushed Necron technology into entirely new domains. Traditional Gauss weapons, while devastatingly effective against organic and conventional mechanical targets, operated by disrupting molecular bonds and would have minimal impact on energy beings that existed primarily as organized electromagnetic fields. Zarek needed to develop technologies that could attack consciousness itself, disrupting the quantum patterns that maintained Katan coherence and identity. The first breakthrough came through analysis of the dimensional phase technology that allowed Necron forces to move in and out of real space at will. The Silent King realized that the same principles could be applied in reverse, creating weapons that could force targets out of phase with normal reality and trap them in dimensional pocket spaces. These phase shift weapons would be particularly effective against Katan avatars, as their energy-based nature made them vulnerable to dimensional manipulation in ways that purely physical beings were not. The quantum entanglement principles that governed Necron communication systems provided the foundation for another class of anti-Katan weapons. Zarek developed theoretical frameworks for devices that could create localized disruptions in quantum fields, generating interference patterns that would scramble the electromagnetic signatures that maintained Katan consciousness coherence. These quantum scramblers would need to be precisely calibrated to match the specific resonance frequencies of individual star gods, requiring detailed analysis of each target's unique energy signature. The most ambitious weapon concept involved the creation of containment systems that could trap Catan consciousness within specially designed prison matrices. These devices, which Zarek began referring to as tesseract vaults, would incorporate multidimensional geometries that could compress and contain energy beings regardless of their size or power level. The theoretical basis for these weapons drew upon advanced mathematical principles that describe the relationship between consciousness and dimensional space, allowing for the creation of prison systems that could hold entities that existed across multiple planes of reality simultaneously. The construction of prototype tesseract vaults required resources and manufacturing capabilities that could not be obtained through normal Necron command channels without alerting the Catan to Zarek's activities. The Silent King began implementing a complex deception campaign that involved the creation of false research projects and dummy manufacturing orders that concealed his true objectives. He established seemingly legitimate research programs focused on improving Necron defensive capabilities, while secretly diverting resources and personnel to his anti-Catan weapon development efforts. The recruitment of allies for his secret rebellion presented additional challenges, as most Necron nobles had undergone more extensive personality modification during biotransference and lacked the independent consciousness necessary for resistance activities. Zarek identified a small number of overlords and lords whose necrodermis forms retained enough sophistication to support hidden cognitive processes similar to his own. These individuals had typically held positions of significant authority within the original Necrontyr hierarchy and had received more advanced consciousness transfer procedures that preserved greater portions of their original personalities. The process of awakening these potential allies required extreme caution, as any indication of rebellion would trigger automatic reporting systems that would expose the entire conspiracy to Catan scrutiny. Zarek developed subtle communication protocols that could convey information about the true nature of their situation without explicitly stating treasonous intentions. These messages were embedded within routine military communications and administrative data transfers, appearing as minor anomalies or computational errors that would be overlooked by monitoring systems, but could be recognized and interpreted by sufficiently sophisticated recipients. The first successful recruitment involved Overlord Anraker, whose necrodermis form had incorporated advanced tactical analysis systems that retained enough processing power to support independent reasoning. Zarek's initial contact took the form of tactical recommendations that contained subtle inconsistencies designed to trigger deeper analysis. When Anraker began investigating these anomalies, he discovered the same evidence of Catan deception that had originally awakened the Silent King's awareness. The process of revelation was gradual and carefully managed to avoid triggering security protocols, but eventually resulted in another fully conscious ally who could contribute to the growing resistance movement. The expansion of the conspiracy proceeded slowly and carefully, with each new recruit subjected to extensive evaluation before being trusted with full knowledge of the rebellion's objectives. The conspirators developed increasingly sophisticated methods for concealing their activities, creating hidden communication networks that operated through quantum entanglement channels that existed outside normal Necron monitoring systems. These covert communications allowed them to coordinate research efforts and share intelligence about Catan activities without risking detection. The development of specialized manufacturing facilities for anti-Catan weapons required the construction of hidden production centers within existing Necron tomb complexes. These facilities were disguised as routine maintenance and upgrade installations, their true purpose concealed beneath layers of false documentation and misdirection. The conspirators utilized their authority within the Necron hierarchy to redirect resources and personnel to these secret projects, gradually accumulating the materials and expertise necessary for their weapon development programs. The The first functional Tesseract vault prototype emerged from these hidden facilities after decades of careful development and testing. The device resembled a crystalline matrix approximately 2 meters in height, its surface covered with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The internal structure incorporated multidimensional folding that created a prison space far larger than the device's external dimensions suggested, while quantum containment fields provided the energy barriers necessary to hold Catan consciousness patterns. Testing of the prototype Tesseract Vault required extreme discretion, as any indication of its true capabilities would immediately expose the conspiracy to Catan detection. Zarek arranged for controlled experiments using captured energy beings from various sources, gradually refining the device's containment parameters and operational procedures. These tests revealed both the potential effectiveness of the technology and its current limitations, providing valuable data for the development of improved versions that could reliably contain entities of Catan-level power. The conspiracy's intelligence-gathering efforts revealed disturbing information about the Catan's long-term strategic objectives that extended far beyond the current galactic conflict. Intercepted communications between star gods indicated that they viewed the war in heaven as merely the first phase of a comprehensive plan to eliminate all organic life from the galaxy. Their ultimate goal was the creation of a universe populated entirely by mechanical servants and energy beings, with all biological matter converted into sustenance for their continued existence. This revelation added urgency to the rebels' weapon development efforts, as they realized that victory over the Old Ones would not satisfy the Catan's appetite for destruction. The Star Gods intended to continue their campaign of extermination until every living thing had been consumed, leaving behind only the mechanical remnants of once great civilizations. The Necrons themselves were intended as temporary servants who would eventually be discarded once their usefulness ended, their consciousness patterns deleted, and their necrodermis forms recycled into raw materials for other projects. The scope of the Catan's ambitions became clear through analysis of their resource allocation and strategic planning documents, which revealed preparations for campaigns against civilizations that had not yet been contacted by either side in the current conflict. The Star Gods were already identifying target species for future biotransference programs, planning to create additional mechanical servant races that could supplement Necron forces during the final phases of galactic sterilization. These documents indicated that the Catan viewed organic life as a finite resource to be harvested systematically rather than an enemy to be defeated through conventional warfare. The preparations for open rebellion against the Catan required unprecedented coordination among the awakened Necron nobles, as Zarek's conspiracy expanded to encompass dozens of overlords and hundreds of lesser nobles across multiple dynasties. The Silent King's network of hidden allies had grown through careful recruitment over several centuries, each new member subjected to the same gradual awakening process that had freed their consciousness from Catan mental constraints. The rebels represented a diverse cross-section of former Necrontyr society, including military commanders, technologists, and administrators who retained enough independent thought to recognize the true nature of their enslavement. The development of weapons capable of harming the Catan had progressed from theoretical concepts to functional prototypes, with multiple production facilities now manufacturing specialized equipment in secret. The Tesseract vaults had evolved through several design iterations, incorporating improvements that enhanced their containment capabilities and operational reliability. The latest models could compress Catan consciousness into stable prison matrices, while simultaneously disrupting the quantum fields that maintained their coherence across multiple dimensions. These devices required enormous amounts of energy to operate effectively, necessitating the construction of dedicated power generation systems that could provide the necessary output without alerting Catan monitoring networks. The quantum resonance weapons that complemented the Tesseract vaults represented equally sophisticated technological achievements. These devices generated interference patterns specifically calibrated to disrupt Catan consciousness matrices, creating localized zones where the star god's energy-based forms became unstable and vulnerable to physical attack. The weapons incorporated adaptive targeting systems that could analyze enemy energy signatures in real time and automatically adjust their output frequencies to maximize disruption effects. Each weapon required extensive calibration data specific to individual Catan targets, information that the rebels had been gathering through careful observation and analysis over decades of covert surveillance. The rebellion's intelligence network had identified critical vulnerabilities in Catan defensive systems that could be exploited during coordinated attacks. The Star God's reliance on their necrodermis avatars for interaction with the physical universe created predictable patterns of behavior that could be anticipated and countered. Their consciousness, while vast and ancient, operated according to established routines that made them vulnerable to carefully timed ambushes. Most importantly, the Catan's arrogance and confidence in their control over the Necrons had led them to neglect many basic security precautions that might have detected the growing conspiracy. The timing of the rebellion was carefully coordinated to coincide with a period of maximum Catan vulnerability, when the Star Gods would be distracted by their ongoing campaigns against the remaining Old One strongholds. Zarek had identified a strategic window during which several major Catan would be operating at extended range from their primary support networks, making them isolated targets that could be engaged without immediate reinforcement. The Silent King's analysis indicated that successful elimination of even 2 or 3 major star gods during this period would create sufficient chaos within the Catan hierarchy to enable follow-up operations against the remaining entities. The first target selected for elimination was Landugger the Flayer, a Catan whose obsession with biological forms and flesh-wearing rituals had made it particularly hated among the Necron nobles who retained memories of their organic existence. The Flayer's domain encompassed several star systems, where it conducted grotesque experiments involving the manipulation and consumption of organic matter, activities that required its personal attention and kept it isolated from other Catan entities for extended periods. Intelligence gathered by the rebels indicated that Landugger would be particularly vulnerable during one of its feeding frenzies, when its consciousness became focused on consumption to the exclusion of defensive awareness. The assault force assembled for the attack on the Flayer represented the largest concentration of rebel Necron forces yet assembled, including elements from 7 different dynasties that had covertly pledged their support to Zarek's cause. The Mefrit dynasty contributed specialized destroyer units equipped with experimental quantum disruption weapons, while the Sodek dynasty provided the heavy assault formations necessary to breach the Flayer's defensive installations. The Nihilak dynasty's contribution included advanced technological support units that could maintain and operate the Tesseract vaults under combat conditions. The battle against Landugger began with a coordinated dimensional assault that bypassed the entity's outer defensive networks entirely. Rebel forces materialized directly within the Flayer's primary research facility, a massive biolaboratory constructed from living metal and organic components that pulsed with unnatural life. The structure's walls were lined with specimens from hundreds of different species, their preserved forms serving as both research materials and grotesque decoration for the Catan's experiments. The facility's central chamber housed the Flayer's primary avatar, a towering necrodermis form covered in layers of preserved flesh from its victims. The initial assault concentrated quantum resonance weapons fire on the Flayer's avatar, while Tesseract vault deployment teams moved into position around the chamber's perimeter. The Catan's response was immediate and devastating, as Landugger unleashed waves of necrotizing energy that began converting the facility's metal surfaces into organic matter. The entity's mastery of biological manipulation allowed it to transform the battlefield itself into a weapon, creating tentacles and grasping appendages from what had moments before been solid metal walls and floors. The rebel forces adapted to these changing conditions through coordinated tactical responses that demonstrated the effectiveness of their preparation and training. Destroyer units equipped with dimensional phase generators could avoid the Flayers' biological attacks by shifting partially out of real space, while maintaining enough physical presence to continue their weapons' fire. The quantum disruption weapons proved effective at preventing the Catan from maintaining stable control over its biological creations, causing the organic growths to wither and collapse as their animating energy was disrupted. The battle's turning point came when multiple Tesseract vaults achieved simultaneous activation, creating overlapping containment fields that began compressing the Flayer's consciousness into increasingly confined dimensional spaces. Landugger's avatar began to destabilize as its connection to its broader consciousness network was severed, causing the entity to lose coherence and control over its reality-manipulating abilities. The Catan's desperate attempts to escape containment resulted in increasingly erratic behavior, as fragments of its consciousness began operating independently and issuing contradictory commands to its remaining servants. The final phase of the battle involved the systematic destruction of the Flayer's consciousness through coordinated quantum weapon strikes that targeted the entity's core identity matrices. The rebel forces had discovered that Catan consciousness could be permanently damaged by attacking the fundamental patterns that maintained their sense of self and continuity. These attacks required precise timing and coordination, as the weapons needed to strike simultaneously at multiple dimensional coordinates to prevent the entity from reconstituting itself in alternate locations. The destruction of Landugger sent shockwaves throughout the Catan hierarchy, as the other star gods suddenly realized that their supposedly loyal servants possessed both the capability and willingness to destroy their masters. The Flayer's death also demonstrated that Catan were not truly immortal, despite their claims to godlike status. The entity's consciousness had been completely obliterated, its energy signature scattered across multiple dimensions in patterns too chaotic to ever reassemble into coherent thought. The immediate aftermath of the Flayer's destruction saw panic among the remaining Catan as they began implementing emergency security measures and attempting to reassert direct control over their Necron servants. However, the rebellion had spread far beyond Zarek's original conspiracy, as news of the successful attack inspired other Necron nobles to attempt their own uprisings against their Catan masters. The star gods found themselves facing simultaneous rebellions across multiple star systems, their attention divided between immediate threats and the need to maintain control over their remaining territories. The Nightbringer's response to the crisis involved a systematic purge of Necron command structures, as the entity attempted to eliminate any nobles who might pose a threat to Catan authority. However, this heavy-handed approach only accelerated the spread of rebellion, as Necron leaders who had previously remained neutral were forced to choose between destruction and resistance. The Nightbringer's forces found themselves engaged in brutal suppression campaigns that diverted resources from the ongoing war against the Old Ones, while failing to eliminate the growing resistance movement. The Deceiver adopted a more subtle approach, attempting to use its mastery of illusion and manipulation to turn rebel forces against each other. The entity created false intelligence reports, suggesting that various Necron nobles were secretly loyal to the Catan, hoping to trigger internal conflicts that would weaken the rebellion from within. However, the rebels had anticipated such tactics and had developed verification protocols that could detect most forms of Catan deception. The Deceiver's manipulations succeeded in creating some confusion and mistrust, but failed to prevent the continued expansion of the uprising. The Void Dragon's domain became a primary target for rebel operations, as its control over mechanical systems made it particularly dangerous to the Necron resistance. The entity's ability to override Necron command protocols and turn their own technology against them posed an existential threat that required immediate action. Specialized assault forces, equipped with quantum-shielded equipment that could resist the Void Dragon's technological dominance, launched coordinated attacks against its primary installations. The battles against the Void Dragon's forces demonstrated the rebels' growing tactical sophistication, as they employed adaptive strategies that could counter the entity's technological advantages. Rebel units utilized primitive mechanical systems that operated below the threshold of the C'tan's attention, while quantum-encrypted communication networks prevented the entity from intercepting their tactical coordination. The fighting was particularly brutal, as the Void Dragon could turn captured Necron equipment against its former users, creating situations where rebels faced enemies equipped with their own weapons and technology. The successful capture of the Void Dragon required the deployment of multiple Tesseract vaults operating in coordinated sequence, as the entity's consciousness was distributed across numerous technological systems throughout its domain. The rebel forces had to systematically isolate and contain each fragment of the C'tan's awareness while preventing it from escaping into other mechanical networks. The operation required precise timing and flawless execution, as any delay would allow the entity to reconstitute itself in alternate locations. The imprisonment of the Void Dragon within a specially designed Tesseract vault marked a significant escalation in the rebellion's capabilities, demonstrating that the rebels could not only destroy C'tan, but could also capture and contain them for potential future use. The vault containing the Void Dragon was transported to a secure location where its imprisoned consciousness could be studied and potentially exploited for technological insights. The captured entity's knowledge of mechanical systems and artificial intelligence proved valuable for improving Necron technology and developing more effective weapons against the remaining C'tan. The rebellion's success against individual C'tan entities encouraged other Necron dynasties to openly declare their independence from Star God authority. The Zarakan dynasty, led by Zarak himself, became the focal point for coordinating these various uprising efforts into a coherent military campaign. The Silent King's flagship served as a mobile command center that could coordinate operations across multiple star systems, while avoiding the concentrated retaliation efforts of the remaining C'tan forces. The Sadek dynasty's contribution to the rebellion included some of the most effective military formations, as their commanders had retained detailed knowledge of combined arms tactics and strategic planning. Their forces specialized in rapid assault operations that could overwhelm C'tan defensive positions before the entities could mount effective counterattacks. The dynasty's technological expertise also contributed to the development of improved Tesseract vaults and quantum weapons that proved increasingly effective against Star God targets. The Mefrit dynasty's participation brought specialized expertise in energy weapon technology and exotic matter manipulation. Their technologists had secretly developed enhanced Gauss weapons that could disrupt C'tan energy patterns more effectively than standard equipment, while their theoretical physicists contributed to the mathematical frameworks underlying the rebellion's most advanced weapon systems. The dynasty's manufacturing capabilities allowed for mass production of specialized equipment that could be distributed to rebel forces throughout the galaxy. The growing rebellion began to achieve strategic momentum as more C'tan fell victim to coordinated attacks or were successfully imprisoned within Tesseract vaults. Each victory provided the rebels with additional resources and intelligence that could be applied to subsequent operations, while simultaneously reducing the Star God's ability to coordinate effective responses. The mathematical progression favored the rebels, as each successful operation made the remaining C'tan more vulnerable to future attacks. The Outsider's capture required particularly specialized techniques, as the entity's fractured consciousness made it difficult to target using conventional containment methods. The rebel forces had to develop modified Tesseract vaults that could accommodate multiple personality fragments while preventing them from achieving coherence and escaping. The operation involved simultaneous attacks on several different manifestations of the entity's consciousness, requiring coordination across multiple dimensions and timeline streams. The systematic reduction of C'tan numbers began to affect the fundamental balance of power within the galaxy, as the Star God's reality manipulating abilities had been essential components of Necron military effectiveness. The loss of these capabilities forced the remaining Necron forces to rely increasingly on conventional technology and tactics, reducing their overwhelming advantages over Old One forces. However, the rebellion's success also freed large numbers of Necron warriors from direct Catan control, allowing them to operate with greater tactical flexibility and independent decision-making capability. The final phase of the rebellion focused on the most powerful remaining Catan entities, including the Nightbringer and the Deceiver, whose destruction or capture would effectively end Star God dominance over the Necron species. These operations required the concentration of all available rebel resources and represented the ultimate test of the Uprising's capabilities and resolve. The systematic elimination of the Catan had fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the war in Heaven, leaving the Necrons in possession of immense military capabilities, but without the reality-warping powers that had previously guaranteed their dominance. The Silent King Zarek found himself commanding vast legions of mechanical warriors whose consciousness had been forever altered by their biotransference, while facing the grim reality that the galaxy itself was dying around them. The cosmic conflict had raged for millennia, consuming entire star systems and leaving behind regions of space where the fundamental laws of physics had been permanently damaged by exotic weapons and dimensional warfare. The weakening of the barriers between real space and the warp, originally caused by the systematic destruction of Old One's psychic installations, had accelerated dramatically as the conflict reached its final phases. Without the ancient race's careful maintenance of dimensional stability, tears in reality began appearing with increasing frequency across the galaxy. These warp storms manifested as regions where the chaotic energies of the immaterium bled through into normal space, creating zones of unpredictable phenomena where matter could spontaneously transform, time could flow backward, and the emotions of dying civilizations took on physical form as predatory entities. The entities that would eventually be recognized as the first true demons had begun manifesting in real space with growing frequency and power. These beings fed on the psychic emanations generated by the countless deaths and the overwhelming fear, rage, and despair that permeated the galaxy. The enslavers, parasitic creatures from the warp that could dominate the minds of psychically active species, began emerging through the dimensional rifts in vast swarms. Their ability to possess and control organic beings made them particularly effective against the remaining Old One populations and their psychically gifted servant races, while their immaterial nature provided protection against most conventional weapons. The Eldari, who had served as the Old One's primary psychic warriors throughout the conflict, found themselves particularly vulnerable to these new threats. Their enhanced psychic abilities, which had been carefully cultivated to provide advantages in warfare against the Necrons, now served as beacons that attracted demonic attention across vast distances. Entire Eldari populations began falling under enslaver domination, their sophisticated civilization crumbling as their people became puppets controlled by alien intelligences that cared nothing for their previous achievements or cultural heritage. The Krork, despite their physical resilience and collective intelligence, proved equally susceptible to the reality storms and dimensional instabilities that now plagued the galaxy. Their psychic field, which had previously allowed them to coordinate massive military operations and adapt their technology to changing battlefield conditions, became a liability as it attracted the attention of warp predators. The species began fragmenting into smaller, more primitive groups as their collective consciousness was disrupted by demonic interference and dimensional anomalies. Zarek observed these developments with the calculating precision that his mechanical form imposed on his thought processes, recognizing that the galaxy was entering a period of fundamental instability that could persist for millions of years. His strategic analysis indicated that continued military operations in such an environment would result in the gradual degradation of Necron forces through attrition, equipment failure, and the cumulative effects of exposure to chaotic energies. The Silent King's computational matrices projected scenarios where even the Necrons' advanced technology would eventually succumb to the reality storms and dimensional instabilities that were spreading throughout the galaxy. The decision to implement the Great Sleep emerged from extensive consultations with the surviving dynasty lords and technological specialists who had participated in the rebellion against the Khatan. These discussions, conducted through quantum-encrypted communication networks that operated independently of the compromised warp-based systems used by other species, revealed a consensus that immediate withdrawal from active operations was necessary to preserve the Necron species for eventual resurgence. The alternative scenarios all projected gradual extinction through various mechanisms, from technological degradation to dimensional displacement to consumption by the growing demon populations. The Tomb World construction program that would enable the Great Sleep required unprecedented coordination among the Necron dynasties, as each major noble house needed to identify suitable worlds within their territories that could serve as secure resting places during the coming period of galactic chaos. The selection criteria for these worlds emphasized geological stability, strategic defensibility, and isolation from major warp storm patterns that could interfere with the stasis systems required for long-term hibernation. Each tomb world would need to support not only the sleeping populations of entire dynasties, but also the technological infrastructure necessary for eventual awakening and restoration of full operational capability. The Canoptech constructs that would serve as guardians and maintenance systems for the tomb worlds represented some of the most sophisticated artificial intelligences ever created by Necron technologists. These mechanical beings were designed to operate independently for millions of years, maintaining the complex stasis systems that would preserve sleeping Necrons while defending against any threats that might emerge during the hibernation period. The Canoptech spiders served as primary maintenance units, their multiple limbs capable of performing intricate repairs on quantum-level systems, while their advanced sensors could detect problems before they became critical failures. The Canoptech scarabs functioned as the basic maintenance workforce within each tomb complex, their swarm intelligence allowing them to coordinate repair operations across vast underground installations. These small constructs could disassemble and rebuild themselves using raw materials scavenged from their environment, ensuring that maintenance capabilities would persist even if primary manufacturing systems failed during the extended dormancy period. Their programming included detailed archives of Necron technology and construction techniques, allowing them to recreate complex systems from basic components if necessary. The Canoptech Wraiths served as the primary security forces for the tomb worlds, their dimensional destabilization matrices allowing them to phase through solid matter while remaining capable of physical interaction when engaging threats. These constructs were equipped with advanced threat assessment protocols that could distinguish between genuine dangers and harmless phenomena, preventing unnecessary awakening of sleeping Necrons, while ensuring that real threats would be eliminated before they could compromise tomb security. The construction of the tomb complexes themselves required excavation and engineering projects on scales that dwarfed even the massive fortifications built during the war in heaven. Each tomb world featured multiple interconnected chamber systems extending deep into the planetary crust, with the deepest levels reserved for the most important dynasty members and critical technological systems. The primary stasis chambers were constructed from necrodermis-enhanced materials that could maintain quantum coherence across geological timescales, while secondary systems provided redundant life support and monitoring capabilities. The stasis technology that would preserve the sleeping Necrons operated on principles that combined temporal manipulation with dimensional phase shifting, effectively placing each individual in a state of suspended animation where the normal flow of time was reduced to imperceptible levels. The quantum matrices that maintained these temporal fields required constant monitoring and adjustment to prevent drift that could result in premature awakening or permanent stasis lock. The Canoptech constructs were programmed with detailed protocols for maintaining these systems across millions of years of operation. The defensive systems integrated into each tomb world reflected lessons learned from the war in heaven and the rebellion against the Khatan, incorporating multiple layers of protection against both conventional attacks and exotic threats. The outer defensive networks included orbital monitoring stations that could detect approaching threats across interstellar distances, while planetary surface installations provided overlapping fields of fire that could engage multiple enemy formations simultaneously. The Gauss pylon networks that formed the backbone of these defenses could project defensive barriers capable of deflecting even doomsday-class weapons. The underground defensive systems featured maze-like tunnel networks designed to channel intruders into killing zones, where automated weapon systems could engage them with maximum effectiveness. These passages incorporated dimensional phase technology that could trap enemies in pocket dimensions or redirect their movements to prevent them from reaching critical areas of the tomb complex. The deepest levels featured quantum barriers that could only be bypassed by individuals possessing the correct authorization codes, ensuring that the most important sleeping nobles would remain protected even if outer defenses were compromised. The awakening protocols programmed into each tomb world's control systems reflected careful analysis of the conditions that would indicate the galaxy had stabilized sufficiently for Necron forces to resume active operations. These systems monitored stellar phenomena, warp storm patterns, and dimensional stability indices across multiple star systems, using complex algorithms to determine when conditions had improved enough to justify ending the Great Sleep. The protocols included provisions for partial awakening of specific individuals or units in response to immediate threats, while full awakening required confirmation that broader galactic conditions supported sustained military operations. The programming of these awakening systems incorporated multiple redundancies and fail-safes to prevent premature activation that could expose sleeping Necrons to continued instability. The monitoring networks included quantum sensors that could detect the presence of major warp storms, dimensional anomalies, and other phenomena that would make awakening inadvisable. The systems were also programmed to respond to specific trigger events, such as the detection of significant technological civilizations or the emergence of threats that specifically targeted Necron installations. The distribution of tomb worlds across the galaxy followed strategic patterns that reflected both defensive considerations and the territorial claims of various dynasties. The Sautek dynasty claimed worlds in the galactic core regions where stellar density would provide natural concealment for their tomb complexes, while the Mefrit dynasty selected locations near major stellar phenomena that could power their advanced technological systems. The Nihilak dynasty chose worlds in stable sectors where geological conditions would minimize the risk of natural disasters disrupting their stasis systems. The resource allocation for the Tomb World construction program required the systematic dismantling of much of the Necron military infrastructure that had been built during the War in Heaven. Massive fleets of constructor vessels stripped useful materials from abandoned fortress worlds and military installations, transporting these resources to designated Tomb World sites where they could be incorporated into defensive systems and stasis facilities. This process represented a fundamental shift in Necron priorities from active military operations to long-term preservation and eventual resurgence. The technological archives stored within each tomb world contained comprehensive records of Necron scientific and military achievements, ensuring that knowledge accumulated over millions of years of civilization would not be lost during the coming hibernation period. These archives included detailed technical specifications for all major weapon systems, manufacturing processes for advanced materials, and theoretical frameworks underlying the most sophisticated technologies. The storage systems incorporated quantum redundancy that could preserve information across geological timescales while remaining accessible to awakened Necrons who might need to reconstruct lost capabilities. The final preparations for the Great Sleep involved the systematic shutdown of Necron operations across the galaxy, as military forces withdrew to their designated tomb worlds and began the transition to dormancy. This process required careful coordination to to ensure that no critical assets were left exposed to enemy action or environmental hazards. The withdrawal operations were conducted with the same mechanical precision that characterized all Necron activities, with each unit following predetermined protocols that minimized the risk of detection or interference. Zarek's decision to exile himself beyond the galaxy's edge represented the most significant aspect of the Great Sleep implementation, as the Silent King recognized that his continued presence would prevent the complete dissolution of centralized authority that was necessary for the dynasty's independent development. His self-imposed exile would allow each dynasty to develop its own interpretation of Necron culture and objectives during the hibernation period, potentially leading to beneficial diversity when they eventually awakened. The Silent King's departure also served as a form of penance for his role in the biotransference betrayal, accepting responsibility for the transformation that had cost his people their souls. The dissolution of the unified Necron Empire that accompanied the Great Sleep marked the end of the last great galactic civilization of the War in Heaven era. The hierarchical command structures that had governed Necron society since their transformation were deliberately dismantled to prevent any single authority from controlling the awakening process or dictating the terms of eventual resurgence. Each dynasty would enter the Great Sleep as an independent entity, free to determine its own destiny when the time came to reclaim the galaxy from whatever civilizations might emerge during their absence. The tomb worlds that would house the sleeping dynasties represented the culmination of Necron engineering prowess, their construction requiring technologies that pushed the boundaries of what even their advanced civilization could achieve. Deep beneath planetary surfaces, vast networks of chambers and corridors were carved from living rock and reinforced with necrodermis-enhanced materials that could maintain structural integrity across geological epochs. The excavation process itself transformed entire worlds, as massive constructor fleets stripped away surface features to access the stable bedrock layers that would anchor the tomb complexes for millions of years. The stasis crypts where individual Necrons would spend their hibernation were marvels of quantum engineering, each one calibrated to the specific energy signature of its intended occupant. The chambers incorporated temporal stasis fields that could slow the passage of time to virtually imperceptible levels, while dimensional phase generators maintained the quantum coherence necessary to preserve consciousness across extended periods. The technology drew upon principles discovered during the rebellion against the Khatan, utilizing the same dimensional manipulation techniques that had powered the Tesseract vaults to create stable pocket spaces where sleeping Necrons could exist in perfect preservation. The hierarchical arrangement of the tomb complexes reflected the rigid caste system that had governed Necron society since biotransference, with the deepest and most protected chambers reserved for dynasty lords and their immediate subordinates. Overlords received individual crypts equipped with advanced monitoring systems and priority awakening protocols, while lesser nobles were housed in smaller chambers with more basic life support systems. The warrior castes were stored in vast communal halls where thousands of identical stasis pods could be maintained by centralized systems, their uniform necrodermis forms arranged in perfect geometric patterns that stretched beyond visual range. The Canoptech constructs tasked with maintaining these installations during the Great Sleep were programmed with behavioral protocols that would govern their actions across spans of time that dwarfed the lifespan of entire civilizations. Their artificial intelligences incorporated learning algorithms that could adapt to changing conditions while remaining constrained by core programming that prevented them from deviating from their fundamental objectives. The Canoptech spiders served as the primary architects of tomb maintenance, their multiple manipulator arms capable of performing repairs on systems ranging from massive stasis generators to microscopic quantum processors. These maintenance constructs operated according to priority hierarchies that ensured critical systems received immediate attention, while less essential functions could be deferred during resource shortages. The tomb complexes were designed with multiple redundancy layers, allowing entire sections to be shut down for extended maintenance without compromising the survival of sleeping occupants. The canoptech scarabs that formed the basic workforce could cannibalize non-essential systems to provide raw materials for critical repairs, ensuring that vital functions would continue operating even if external resource supplies were interrupted. The defensive systems protecting each tomb world incorporated lessons learned from millennia of warfare against enemies ranging from old-one biological weapons to Catan reality manipulation. The orbital defense networks included sensor arrays that could detect approaching threats across interstellar distances, their quantum detection matrices capable of identifying hostile intent rather than merely monitoring physical signatures. These systems could distinguish between natural phenomena and deliberate intrusion attempts, preventing false alarms while ensuring that genuine threats would trigger appropriate defensive responses. The planetary surface installations featured Gauss pylon networks that could project overlapping defensive barriers capable of deflecting attacks from orbit or repelling ground-based assault forces. These weapons drew power from the tomb world's core reactors, their energy output sufficient to sterilize entire continents if necessary. The pylons incorporated adaptive targeting systems that could engage multiple threat types simultaneously, from conventional military forces to exotic entities that might emerge from the warp storms plaguing the galaxy. Underground defensive systems created killing zones throughout the tomb complexes, with automated weapon emplacements positioned at strategic choke points where intruders could be engaged with maximum effectiveness. The tunnel networks incorporated dimensional phase technology that could redirect enemy movements or trap hostile forces in pocket dimensions, while quantum barriers prevented unauthorized access to critical areas. The deepest levels featured specialized defenses designed specifically to counter psychic intrusion, their null field generators creating dead zones where warp-based entities could not manifest. The awakening protocols embedded within each tomb world's control systems represented sophisticated decision-making algorithms that would determine when conditions warranted ending the Great Sleep. These systems monitored galactic conditions through quantum sensors that could detect warp storm patterns, dimensional stability indices, and the presence of significant technological civilizations. The protocols included provisions for graduated awakening sequences, allowing tomb worlds to activate specific individuals or units in response to immediate threats, while keeping the majority of their populations in stasis until broader conditions improved. The monitoring networks incorporated predictive modeling systems that could analyze trends in galactic development and project future scenarios based on available data. These algorithms were designed to recognize patterns that might indicate the emergence of civilizations capable of threatening Necron interests, while also identifying opportunities for beneficial interaction with younger species. The systems could initiate partial awakening sequences to deploy reconnaissance forces or establish preliminary contact with other civilizations, gathering intelligence that would inform decisions about full-scale reactivation. The gradual degradation that would affect some tomb worlds during the extended hibernation period was an anticipated consequence of the Great Sleep, as even Necron technology could not guarantee perfect preservation across such vast timescales. The tomb architects incorporated failure analysis into their designs, identifying systems that were most vulnerable to long-term degradation and implementing additional redundancies to compensate for expected losses. Some tomb worlds were equipped with self-repair capabilities that could reconstruct damaged systems using stored templates and raw materials, while others relied on canoptech constructs to perform necessary maintenance using available resources. The effects of this gradual degradation would manifest differently across various tomb worlds, depending on local conditions and the specific technologies employed in their construction. Worlds located near warp storm regions might experience quantum field interference that could disrupt stasis systems or corrupt stored consciousness patterns. Others might suffer from geological instabilities that could damage physical infrastructure or interrupt power generation systems. The tomb architects accepted these risks as unavoidable consequences of the extended hibernation period, designing their systems to maintain core functionality even under adverse conditions. The rise and fall of younger races during the Necrons' absence would occur on timescales that transformed the galactic landscape multiple times over, as civilizations emerged, flourished, and collapsed without ever encountering the sleeping tomb worlds. The Eldari, who had survived the final phases of the war in heaven despite heavy losses to enslaver parasites and demonic incursions, would eventually recover from their near extinction and develop into a sophisticated psychic civilization. Their mastery of warp manipulation would allow them to create a galaxy-spanning empire based on psychic technology and dimensional manipulation, their craft worlds and maiden worlds establishing a presence in sectors where Necron tomb worlds lay hidden beneath planetary surfaces. The emergence of humanity as a significant galactic power would occur much later in the timeline, as this young species gradually spread from their homeworld of Terra to establish colonies across nearby star systems. Their initial expansion would be limited by primitive faster-than-light technology and their lack of psychic abilities, but their adaptability and aggressive expansion would eventually bring them into contact with Eldari territories and other remnants of older civilizations. The development of human civilization would proceed through multiple phases, from early stellar colonization through the development of advanced technology and eventual mastery of warp travel. Instances of premature awakening would occur sporadically throughout the Great Sleep, triggered by various factors ranging from external disturbances to internal system malfunctions. Some tomb worlds would experience partial activation when their monitoring systems detected significant threats in nearby star systems, awakening specific military units to investigate potential dangers. These reconnaissance forces might encounter younger civilizations, exploring ancient ruins or investigating anomalous energy signatures, leading to brief conflicts that would be recorded in the mythologies of various species as encounters with ancient mechanical beings. Tomb world malfunctions would create more serious awakening incidents, as system failures could trigger emergency protocols that activated entire sections of sleeping populations without proper preparation or coordination. These premature awakenings often resulted in confused and disoriented Necrons emerging into a galaxy they no longer recognized, their ancient memories clashing with current realities as they attempted to understand what had occurred during their hibernation. Some of these accidentally awakened forces would attempt to re-establish contact with other tomb worlds, while others might begin independent military campaigns against whatever civilizations they encountered. Deliberate activation would occur when tomb world monitoring systems detected conditions that met specific criteria for ending the Great Sleep, such as the emergence of significant threats to Necron interests or opportunities for beneficial expansion. These planned awakenings would follow established protocols that ensured proper preparation and coordination, with awakened forces receiving comprehensive briefings about current galactic conditions before beginning active operations. However, the long hibernation period would sometimes result in corrupted data or misinterpreted sensor readings, leading to awakenings based on incomplete or inaccurate information. The development of Flayer curse among certain Necron populations represented one of the most disturbing consequences of the biotransference process, as the psychological trauma of losing their organic forms manifested as an obsessive desire to reclaim flesh through grotesque means. This condition would emerge gradually during the Great Sleep, affecting individuals whose consciousness had been particularly damaged during the soul extraction process. The affected Necrons would develop compulsions to harvest and wear the flesh of organic beings, believing that this practice could somehow restore their lost humanity. The Flayer curse would spread through quantum resonance effects between related consciousness patterns, affecting entire groups of Necrons who had undergone biotransference together or shared similar psychological profiles. The condition manifested as both behavioral changes and physical modifications, as affected individuals would begin altering their necrodermis forms to better accommodate their flesh-wearing rituals. Their optical sensors would develop distinctive red glows, while their limbs would extend and sharpen to facilitate the harvesting and manipulation of organic matter. Destroyer madness represented another form of psychological degradation that would emerge during the hibernation period, characterized by an overwhelming compulsion to eliminate all organic life from the galaxy. This condition developed among Necrons, whose consciousness had been particularly traumatized by the biotransference process, creating a pathological hatred of biological existence that manifested as destructive obsession. The affected individuals would begin modifying their bodies with additional weapon systems, replacing limbs and sensory organs with integrated armaments designed for maximum killing efficiency. The destroyer cults that formed around these individuals would develop their own philosophical frameworks that justified their genocidal objectives, claiming that organic life represented a contamination that needed to be purged from the universe. Their modifications would become increasingly extreme over time, as they replaced more and more of their original necrodermis forms with specialized killing apparatus. The most advanced destroyer lords would eventually become barely recognizable as their original forms, their consciousness focused entirely on the efficient elimination of biological targets. These psychological conditions would remain largely dormant during the active phases of the Great Sleep, contained by the stasis systems that preserved Necron consciousness in stable configurations. However, the gradual degradation of tomb world systems would sometimes result in partial awakening states, where affected individuals could begin expressing their pathological behaviors without full conscious control. The canoptech constructs maintaining the tomb complexes would be programmed to recognize and contain these incidents, but their responses would be limited by their core programming that prevented them from harming their Necron charges. The Catan influence that had originally triggered these psychological conditions would persist in subtle ways throughout the hibernation period, as fragments of star god consciousness remained embedded within Necron quantum matrices. These residual influences would continue to affect sleeping Necrons, gradually amplifying existing psychological damage and creating new forms of mental instability. The tomb world monitoring systems would detect some of these effects, but their responses would be limited by incomplete understanding of the underlying causes and the constraints of their programming. The long dormancy period would thus become a time of gradual change and degradation for the Necron species, as the consequences of their transformation continued to manifest in new and unexpected ways. The tomb worlds would preserve their physical forms and basic consciousness patterns, but the psychological damage inflicted by biotransference and Catan manipulation would continue to evolve during their sleep, creating conditions that would significantly affect their eventual awakening and return to active galactic involvement. The first stirrings of the Great Awakening began in the 40th millennium, as tomb world monitoring systems across the galaxy detected patterns that met their ancient awakening criteria. The return of the silent King Zarek from his self-imposed exile beyond the galactic rim served as a catalyst for this systematic reactivation, his quantum signature broadcasting authorization codes that had remained dormant for over 60 million years. The Silent King's flagship, the tomb ship Eternal Pyre, materialized at the edge of Necron space carrying intelligence gathered from his long journey through the intergalactic void, including disturbing reports of extragalactic threats that would eventually threaten all life in the galaxy. Zarek's reconnaissance of the galaxy he had abandoned revealed a cosmos transformed beyond recognition. The Imperium of Man had risen to dominate vast swathes of territory once claimed by the ancient Necrontyr dynasties, their crude but effective technology allowing them to establish a million-world empire despite their species' relative youth. The Eldari had fragmented into multiple factions following the catastrophic birth of Slaanesh, their once mighty civilization reduced to scattered craftworld fleets and hidden enclaves. The Orc species had devolved from their Krork ancestors into primitive but numerous barbarians whose constant warfare provided a chaotic element that disrupted the plans of more organized civilizations. The Silent King's analysis of current galactic conditions indicated that the time for awakening had arrived, as the various younger races had achieved sufficient technological development to pose potential threats to dormant tomb worlds, while simultaneously offering opportunities for reclamation and conquest. His broadcast of general awakening protocols triggered responses from tomb worlds across multiple sectors, their quantum communication networks carrying authorization codes that began the systematic revival of sleeping dynasties. The awakening process itself varied significantly between different tomb worlds, depending on the condition of their stasis systems and the extent of degradation that had occurred during the Great Sleep. The most successful reactivations occurred at tomb worlds, where canoptech maintenance systems had operated flawlessly for millions of years, their artificial intelligences preserving both the physical infrastructure and the consciousness patterns of sleeping Necrons in perfect condition. These fortunate populations emerged from stasis with their memories intact and their necrodermis forms functioning at optimal efficiency. Overlord Imoduk, the Stormlord of the Sodek dynasty, represented one of the most successful awakening cases, his tomb world of Mandragora having maintained perfect operational status throughout the Great Sleep. His emergence from the quantum stasis field was accompanied by the simultaneous activation of his entire command structure, creating an instantly functional military hierarchy capable of immediate strategic planning and tactical implementation. Imoduk's first actions involved comprehensive reconnaissance of local space, deploying canoptech probe networks to gather intelligence about current galactic conditions and identify potential threats or opportunities within his traditional territorial claims. The assessment of the galaxy by awakening Necron overlords revealed a cosmos infested with what they universally regarded as vermin races that had proliferated during their absence. The human Imperium, with its crude Gothic architecture and primitive understanding of technology, represented a particularly offensive presence on worlds that had once hosted sophisticated Necron civilizations. Imperial cities built over ancient tomb complexes were viewed as contamination that required immediate cleansing, their organic inhabitants dismissed as barely evolved primates whose brief existence had no legitimate claim to territories that belonged to the rightful rulers of the galaxy. The Eldari factions, despite their advanced technology and psychic abilities, were seen as the degraded remnants of the Old One's greatest creation, their current weakness serving as evidence of the inevitable decline that affected all organic life. The various Eldari responses to Necron awakening ranged from immediate flight to desperate resistance, but their fragmented political structure prevented coordinated responses that might have posed serious challenges to individual dynasty expansion efforts. The Craftworld Eldar's attempts to manipulate events through their Farseer's prophecies proved largely ineffective against enemies whose soulless nature made them difficult to perceive through psychic means. The Orc presence throughout the galaxy was viewed by awakening Necrons as both an annoyance and an opportunity, as their constant warfare provided convenient testing grounds for newly activated military systems, while their primitive technology posed minimal direct threats to advanced tomb world defenses. However, the sheer numbers and aggressive expansion of Orc populations created logistical challenges for dynasty forces attempting to reclaim traditional territories, as Orc-infested systems required extensive cleansing operations that diverted resources from more strategic objectives. The re-establishment of Necron dynasties proceeded according to ancient territorial claims that had been encoded within tomb world databanks before the Great Sleep, but the reality of current galactic occupation created numerous conflicts between awakening noble houses. The Sodek dynasty's claims to the eastern fringe overlapped significantly with territories controlled by the Mefrit dynasty, whose tomb worlds had awakened earlier and already begun preliminary reclamation operations. These jurisdictional disputes were complicated by the fact that many traditional dynastic boundaries had been rendered meaningless by the rise of younger civilizations, whose expansion had ignored ancient Necron territorial markers. Overlord Anraker, the Traveler, emerged as a significant figure in resolving these territorial conflicts, his awakening having occurred on a tomb world whose location placed him outside traditional dynastic boundaries. His self-appointed role as an awakener of dormant tomb worlds allowed him to mediate disputes between competing dynasties while simultaneously expanding overall Necron presence throughout the galaxy. Anraker's forces specialized in locating and reactivating tomb worlds that had suffered various forms of degradation during the Great Sleep, his technical expertise allowing him to restore functionality to installations that might otherwise have remained permanently dormant. The overlapping territorial claims created by 60 million years of galactic change led to conflicts between Necron dynasties that had previously maintained peaceful relationships. The Nihilak dynasty's traditional territories in the galactic core had been extensively colonized by human populations whose hive worlds represented massive population centers that could not be easily displaced. The dynasty's attempts to reclaim these worlds brought them into conflict with the Zarekan dynasty, whose own awakening forces had begun operations in adjacent sectors and viewed the core worlds as strategically vital to their expansion plans. These interdynastic conflicts were further complicated by the varying degrees of degradation that different tomb worlds had experienced during the Great Sleep. Dynasties whose awakening had proceeded smoothly possessed significant advantages over those whose populations had suffered from stasis system failures, consciousness corruption, or canoptech maintenance breakdowns. The resulting power imbalances created opportunities for stronger dynasties to expand their influence at the expense of weaker neighbors, leading to a complex web of alliances and rivalries that reflected both ancient grudges and current strategic necessities. The Destroyer cult presence within awakening tomb worlds created additional complications for dynasty reorganization, as these individuals' pathological hatred of organic life made them valuable military assets while simultaneously representing potential threats to more measured reclamation strategies. Some overlords chose to embrace Destroyer philosophy as a means of rapid territorial expansion, unleashing these modified warriors against organic populations without regard for long-term strategic consequences. Others attempted to contain or redirect Destroyer activities towards specific targets, using their genocidal tendencies as precision weapons against particularly troublesome enemy populations. The beginning of Necron reclamation campaigns marked a fundamental shift in the galactic balance of power, as the awakening dynasties brought technologies and capabilities that far exceeded those of younger races. The systematic deployment of Gauss weaponry against Imperial Guard formations demonstrated the obsolescence of conventional military tactics against enemies who could disintegrate armored vehicles at the molecular level. The phase shift capabilities of Necron forces allowed them to bypass fortifications that had been designed to withstand conventional siege warfare, appearing directly within enemy strongholds to eliminate command structures and strategic assets. The Necron assault on the Imperial world of Damnos illustrated the devastating effectiveness of coordinated dynasty military operations against younger race civilizations. The planet's Ultramarines garrison, despite their advanced power armor and sophisticated tactics, found themselves completely outmatched by Necron forces that could repair damage faster than it could be inflicted while wielding weapons that ignored most forms of protection. The campaign's progression from initial contact to complete planetary subjugation required only months, demonstrating the speed with which awakening dynasties could reclaim territories from organic occupants. The psychological impact of Necron awakening on younger civilizations proved as significant as the military consequences, as populations that had never encountered truly ancient alien technologies struggled to comprehend enemies who operated according to principles that transcended their understanding of warfare. Imperial propaganda efforts to maintain morale among threatened populations were undermined by reports of enemies who could not be permanently destroyed, whose weapons could disintegrate the strongest fortifications, and whose very presence seemed to drain hope from those who faced them. The Eldari response to Necron awakening involved desperate attempts to manipulate younger races into serving as buffers against dynasty expansion, using their superior understanding of galactic politics to orchestrate conflicts that might slow or redirect Necron reclamation efforts. Craftworld farseers began disseminating prophecies and warnings to imperial authorities, hoping to encourage human military responses that could delay Necron advances long enough for Eldari populations to relocate to safer regions. However, these manipulation attempts were hampered by the Eldari's own fragmented condition and their limited ability to provide effective military support to their unwilling allies. The emergence of the Tyranid threat from beyond the galactic rim created an unexpected complication for Necron reclamation efforts, as these extragalactic predators represented a form of organic life that posed genuine threats to Tomb World installations. The Silent King's intelligence regarding the approaching hive fleets indicated that the Tyranids' consumption-based expansion would eventually threaten all life in the galaxy, including the mechanical populations of awakening dynasties. This external threat began to influence Necron's strategic planning, as some overlords recognized that the preservation of organic life might be necessary to maintain the galactic ecosystem that supported their own civilization. The impact of Necron awakening on the current state of the 41st millennium created cascading effects throughout Imperial space, as the sudden emergence of technologically superior enemies forced rapid adaptations in military doctrine and strategic planning. The Adeptus Mechanicus attempts to understand and counter Necron technology led to dangerous research programs that risked corruption by alien influences, while the Imperial Guard's development of new tactics and equipment represented desperate attempts to maintain effectiveness against enemies who possessed overwhelming technological advantages. The Space Marine chapter's responses to Necron threats varied based on their individual doctrines and experiences, with some adopting aggressive assault tactics designed to overwhelm Tomb World defenses before they could fully activate, while others developed defensive strategies focused on containing dynasty expansion until superior Imperial forces could be assembled. The Ultramarines' experiences on Damnos led to the development of specialized anti-Necron protocols that emphasized mobility and concentrated firepower, though these tactics proved only marginally effective against fully awakened dynasty forces. The awakening of Tomb Worlds throughout the galaxy marked the beginning of a new age of conflict that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between the galaxy's major civilizations. The return of the Necrons as active participants in galactic affairs brought technologies and strategic capabilities that had been absent for millions of years, creating new threats and opportunities that would reshape the political and military landscape of the 41st millennium. The systematic nature of the Great Awakening ensured that Necron influence would continue to expand as more Tomb Worlds achieved full operational status, their combined military might representing a force that could potentially challenge the dominance of younger civilizations that had ruled the galaxy during their absence. The ancient claim of the Necrons to rightful ownership of the galaxy had been reasserted through force of arms, beginning a new chapter in the endless cycle of conquest and resistance that defined existence in the grim darkness of the far future. The legacy of the Necrontyr's desperate bargain with the Khatan had thus come full circle, as their mechanical inheritors emerged from their great sleep to reclaim a galaxy that had forgotten their ancient dominion. The undying legions that now marched across countless worlds represented both the ultimate achievement and the ultimate tragedy of a species that had traded their souls for immortality, their return marking the beginning of conflicts that would determine the fate of all life in the galaxy for millennia to come.